The biggest problem with being born in the 1980s and coming up in the absolute greatest era of gaming, the 90s, and no, that is not up for debate, is that a lot of what you used to love about video games has changed so much the entire medium is almost unrecognizable at this point. I was lucky enough to live through a time when survival horror games were almost everywhere you looked. No matter what console you had, there was bound to be some kind of title chasing after that Resident Evil market share, which to someone like me who became obsessed with the genre is akin to heaven on earth. And while we definitely haven't reached that same level again, I'm actually really surprised with the resurgence the survival horror genre has seen recently. However, I haven't always been this positive on the subject. A good while back, the popularity of first-person, non-combat streamer bait sort of soured me on the whole indie horror scene, and I was convinced that no company would pass up the massive paycheck that would come from farting one of these boring-ass games out and having some Markiplier clone pretend to be scared by it. But after getting my hands on a few real-deal, honest-to-goodness modern survival horror games, I can fully confirm that position is changed. Maybe devs nowadays do understand what it really takes to make a game in this genre, and there may be a slight chance I judged an entire sector of the industry based on a few bad apples. So today I'm looking to do a little redeeming because I'm starting to think there are a lot of cool titles I may have missed out on. Much like my Retro RE Clone series, we'll be taking a look at a good handful of titles in this video, and the criteria is very simple. The game has to in some significant way be chasing that familiar Resident Evil experience. And before you say it, because you absolutely will say it, I do know that technically RE is a clone of Alone in the Dark. I also play video games, but Capcom's Zombie Massacre Sim is the very first time the term survival horror was coined, and let's be real here, it, not Alone in the Dark, cemented everything we know about the genre today. And that means if we're going to cover it here today, it must have at least most of these boxes checked. Tank controls, exploration-driven gameplay with an emphasis on backtracking, inventory management, a heavy horror atmosphere helped along by a strong feeling of isolation, adventure game-inspired puzzle solving requiring a mix of both mechanical manipulation and item hunting, and of course pre-rendered backdrops, fixed camera perspectives, and limited resources are always a plus. Now I know a lot of you are very eager to tell me exactly how wrong I am, and I very well could be. Believe me, it's not like it's an entirely rare occurrence around here, but for the time being, I'm the guy making the mediocre YouTube content, so as long as that's the case, those are the rules. And with that boring nonsense out of the way, I think it's high time we do what we all came here for and jump into some awesome modern Resident Evil clones. Alright, if we're gonna have some kind of a list chronicling modern survival horror, it's only fitting it starts with a phrase I use most often when talking about video games, music, and my overall taste in fashion. Back in 1995 is an interesting little throwback that hit the scene around 2016 and was developed by a single dev headquartered here in my new home, Tokyo, and it is very clear this guy really enjoyed that early 90s aesthetic right from the start. Not only is this a modern-ish title that plays exclusively in 4x3, but it also includes that oh-so-familiar 90s 3D look. Character models are made up of very simple, low-detail polygons. The environment actually displays an effect close to the affine texture warping the PS1 was so well known for, and the enemies are unrecognizable as anything other than randomly assembled geometric shapes, aka exactly how I like them. And if I'm being honest, that might be the very first stumbling block right out of the gate. If you grew up with this look, you were either very intrigued with what you're seeing right now, or at the very least able to overlook it, but I feel like people without nostalgia for this specific style might be a little turned off. But let's say you're willing to overcome that hurdle. Well, what are you in for? Much like its look, back in 1995 sticks very close to the games that inspired it. You move around with tank controls, combat is handled with the tried and true hold a shoulder button to aim and hit the action button to fire, ammo and healing items are limited, killing every enemy isn't always going to be a good idea, and most of the doors you come across are going to be locked. Truth be told, it's a damn love letter to early survival horror, but sometimes that's to its own detriment. Combat can be incredibly unwieldy, with the game's only melee weapon taking round about 3.5 years to swing. Enemies do have very long, readable wind-ups before attacks, which is good because this game has no run button, so I hope you're good at using tank controls because there's no quick turn or evasive maneuvers here. Like I said, it's clear this thing is aiming for accuracy to that early idea of the genre, but before we get too deep, let's talk about the story, which it turns out is pretty damn easy because there is not much of it, especially at the start. In fact, why don't I go ahead and show you the game's entire opening.
So that's the tower. Guess I'll make my way there.
Yep, pretty straightforward, I would say. Essentially, you've woken up in this odd dystopian wasteland where monsters have taken over and you make up some unknown percentage of a dwindling population. It seems like the survivors in this city have all made their way to the tops of tall buildings, barricading the exits to keep the monsters from getting in, and there's a sort of zip line system linking buildings together. In the center of this city sits a tall tower, and our main character hears a voice calling him towards it, and for most of the game this is all you're gonna get. There are of course a few survivors to talk to, but they don't exactly spill any beans on the situation, mostly because they're too busy having you run errands for them. Throughout the playthrough, you'll come across scattered notes detailing some mentally unhinged person, monsters being spotted, and some kind of an accident with a large hadron collider which might be at the center of all this. Of course, you'll come across details revealing what's really going on here, but until you reach the end, it's not likely that they're going to make much sense to you, and I think that's probably the best way to have done this. Don't get me wrong, I love a good deep story, but sometimes all you really need is to plop the player down in a world they don't understand, point them to a spot on the map, and say, you'll know more when you get there. I won't spoil the ending here, but let's just say it perfectly matches the disturbing nature of the game's setup, but in a way you may not expect. Despite the low poly look of the game, it's able to pull off a surprisingly effective atmosphere of dread and isolation. The abandoned office buildings you explore aren't exactly lifelike, but look close enough to the real deal that it's almost eerie. You're only ever going to run into maybe 3 or 4 survivors, so you're definitely going to feel alone, and even though the enemies don't look scary even in the least, they have this sort of uncanny effect, and the sheer fact that everyone in this world seems to find them terrifying sort of makes you feel that way as well.
What the hell is that?
Honestly, I was not expecting this game to do this good of a job at disturbing me, and I think a major player in that is the soundtrack. It's mostly long, single-note synth melodies with a sort of barren sound to them, and it really enforces this feeling that something's off around here. I think more than anything, Back in '95 deserves a play just for the atmosphere alone. It's only going to take you maybe a couple of hours to get through at most, and I think it's certainly worth checking out. That being said, there are some real downsides you should probably know about first. Like I said before, this game definitely strives for authenticity, but it often forgoes smart game design in that pursuit. For example, the slow movement speed and lack of a run button is really going to wear on you after a bit. And on that same note, I don't think it was necessary for the melee attack to be this ass. People always seem to complain that combat is clunky in these games, but that always seems to be the ones who aren't very good at playing them. In reality, survival horror combat is a very strict dance of spacing, planning, and mechanical mastery. It's really far deeper than most people know, but here in '95 it almost feels like the game's satirizing that. On top of that, I think text prompts showing up on screen stay there way too long, which means if you're unfamiliar with an area and head to the same locked door a few times, which you will do, you're going to have to stare at a still screen till the text goes away pretty often. And this is going to sound like heresy, but I also didn't like how many steps were taken in the name of chasing after that early PS1 and Sega Saturn look. The texture warping here is definitely close to what you might see in a real game released on the PlayStation, but it is taken to a far extreme. Trust me, even the worst offending PS1 titles did not warp this bad. I also didn't like that there's an ugly, low-res 2D image masking the left and right sides of the screen. Personally, I think it would have been fine to leave those areas blank, but if you are going to put an image there, maybe make it a higher res one. On the plus side, there are these really cool sort of CRT effects baked in here, and I get the feeling the dev intended the game to be played with these on, but even at the lowest preset, they really hurt my eyes after just a few minutes of gameplay. Also, and this is going to be very picky here, but the game displays a tracking artifact on screen when you use the CRT effects, but that wouldn't even be present on a console connected through RF because that's a VHS thing. That being said, the 4x3 display and CRT effects are a great idea on paper. I just wish they would have been implemented maybe a little better. The puzzles here are definitely good enough to get your brain working, and that's always nice, but I really would have loved to see more mechanically involved ones. As far as I remember, the vast majority that I came across took the form of combination locks, with clues to that combination being hidden in the area I was in. Not the worst thing in the world, but a little variety would have been nice. Gameplay areas are also very sectioned off from each other, which is sort of good because there's no in-game map, so you're not going to have to commit large multi-level buildings to memory, but it also means that if you find a key, it 99.99% of the time is going to need to be used within 3 rooms of where you found it. All that aside though, I enjoyed the hell out of this one. It really gives its all in trying to recreate that early survival horror feel, and in most ways it achieves that goal. It's clearly a very small project, and you can tell it's one the developer really put their heart into. I'd love to see what this guy comes up with a little feedback and a far increased budget. Now, this is nowhere near a perfect gameplay experience, but it does an amazing job at making you feel like you've been teleported back to the 90s, and for the longest time it took a few hours of old Resident Evil games and the House Party movies to have that effect on me. Back in 1995 has been released almost everywhere, so you shouldn't have a hard time getting a hold of it, and I recommend you do just that. It's a warts and all type of homage made by someone who not only understands the genre, but seems to also have a lot of reverence for it. And hey, extra authenticity points for cheesy voice acting, right?
You want me to wait?
That's right. Just sit tight.
Nightmare of Decay has been making the rounds on YouTube lately, and I might have never thought to try it out if it weren't for a Twitter follower tagging me in a post that G-Man Lives made about the game, and hot damn am I glad I checked my notifications that day. Anyone familiar with my views on RE7 will know I respect the hell out of that game for bringing the series much closer to its survival horror roots than it's been in years, but I just did not consider it a proper entry in the genre, and a portion of that was thanks to its perspective. And yes, I know that sounds insane, trust me, I've heard the arguments before, but hear me out. Would you call Duke Nukem Time to Kill a first-person shooter? I would assume no, and that's because sometimes when a game's perspective is baked into its overall gameplay design, it can also be responsible for the genre that game fits into. And in my opinion, survival horror sort of requires the perspective of the games that created the genre. I'm crazy like that. Well, anyways, I bring this up because if you haven't been watching so far, this is indeed a first-person game, and I do think it plays a lot like Resident Evil. But hey, even if you disagree with my wacky reasoning utilizing this crazy new concept called objective reality, there is a silver lining. This just happens to be a video talking about games looking to clone Resident Evil and not necessarily the survival horror genre that Resident Evil belongs to, and that essentially means we're both off the hook and don't have to argue. I mean, unless you want to. I can't tell you what to do, right? Nightmare of Decay is a first-person Resident Evil clone in the strictest sense of the term. We get an emphasis on conserving resources, item hunting, puzzle solving, backtracking, exploration, the whole shebang. And I'm gonna let you in on a little secret here. It's fucking awesome. I will admit, at first I got a low-budget feel from the game's intro, and to be fair, I doubt a whole lot of money went into this project, but don't make my mistake and confuse low budget for low effort. This thing absolutely excels at capturing the spirit of early RE titles in a way that shows me the developers really appreciate a good survival horror romp. The story here is interesting because it sort of doesn't matter. You play some schlub living the bachelor's life when he hears about disappearances plaguing his area and how each victim had been suffering from terrible nightmares and hallucinations. And he just so happens to be having the same issue. So our guy goes to sleep, which obviously you'd want to do immediately after seeing some guy holding a severed head in your living room. I mean, how could you not? Well, anyways, he wakes up in front of a creepy-ass mansion, and after talking to a cat, an activity I do on a daily basis, he makes his way inside. After this initial event, though, I'm gonna go ahead and admit the story may as well not exist, and with gameplay this damn satisfying, I'm totally okay with that. But if that is a deal breaker for you, there's a running plot about the mansion itself and the guy who owns it, which does sort of attempt to explain what's going on here. That being said though, even if you missed every single one of these journal entries, you're still going to have a blast with this one. Nightmare of Decay does a great job of staying true to the spirit of 90s zombie dodging games, but in a very interesting and novel way. For example, since you have full control over where you aim and shoot, you'd assume combat is much easier than any survival horror game. But there are tiny checks and balances here that keep that from being true. Combat here is still all about spacing and positioning, since your walk speed is pretty damn slow and running drains a very small stamina meter when enemies are around. On top of that, you slow to an absolute crawl while reloading, so you're gonna want to make sure you keep track of a whole bunch of factors before taking aim at one of these shambling corpses. Attacks can hurt you real bad, and healing items are nowhere near as plentiful as you would like, at least not on your first run, so you're definitely gonna want to be smart about how and when you decide to put a bad guy down. But the combat here, while really fun and deserving of praise, isn't even the shining star in this game in my opinion. If you ask me, all the fun was in navigating the mansion, finding key items, and solving puzzles so I could unlock more areas to explore. You know, survival horror stuff. The head scratchers here tend more towards the easier side of things, but they're still fun to figure out and don't screech progress to a halt when they appear, which is always nice. You can really tell what games these guys spent most of their time with back in the day, and their passion is made for one hell of a fun RE clone. That being said, as far as tone goes, the horror aspect of survival horror is not a big part of the experience. I mean, okay, maybe there are a few small snippets of things that could be considered scary maybe, but while I was playing, I more got the feeling that this is an homage to the horror that you used to see in old games from this genre, not necessarily an attempt at scaring the player. A spirit that is most definitely present in the enemy roster. I mean, don't get me wrong, I will always appreciate a game that has you spending most of your time gunning down zombies, but the weird gun-wielding cultists, armor-clad knights, and mimics lets me know that they were just trying to put interesting foes in a game centered around having fun, and maybe taking itself seriously did not rank too high on their list of priorities. And speaking of fun, this bad boy is absolutely chocked full of references to other horror media. At one point, I thought I was losing my mind because I could have swore I was fighting Angela from Silent Hill 2, but after coming across a guy who was clearly James Sunderland, I'd say I'm not the crazy one here. There's also this great tension-building lead-up to a very specific Monty Python joke, a very cheeky callback to RE1's zombie reveal, and maybe you could argue the cultist are a blood reference. Like I said before, these guys were more interested in having fun than leading you through some dead serious experience, and that makes for one very light, sort of pick-up-and-play kind of atmosphere. I mean, the combat is challenging, and you're definitely going to want to avoid needlessly wasting ammo, so it's not like it's a walk in the park, it just feels really carefree while also being really solidly designed. If I had any complaints at all, it would be that the game isn't very long, but to directly counter that, that's a very typical experience for an RE game, and I did get it for a cool 500 yen, which is a little less than $5. I also found that my second time around I could breeze through the game relatively effortlessly, but hey, that's kind of the reward you get when you finish a game in this genre, right? For what it is though, Nightmare of Decay is an awesome value. For a measly $5, you can lock yourself into a good 2 or maybe 3 hours worth of a really great Resident Evil clone, and if you ask me, that is not a very high price to pay for what you get. In my opinion, this dev house is one to keep your eyes on because they clearly understand what makes these games tick, and here's hoping all the attention Nightmare of Decay's been getting inspires these guys to attempt an even more substantial entry in the genre. But hey, even if it doesn't, we still got an amazingly fun few hours out of their efforts, and in a class of games that nearly went extinct, I'd say that's probably a best case scenario. Now here's something I've been meaning to check out for a long time. Dreadout showed up on my radar years ago back when the demo was getting a lot of press, and I was pretty intrigued. It was essentially Indonesian Fatal Frame from what I can tell, and that sounds like an interesting idea. So I downloaded the demo on Steam, tried it for a minute or two, but then had to leave the house for a bit and never really picked it up again. Years went by, and I guess I never really found a reason to pick it back up until now, and here's the strange thing. When I went to start it up for this video, it was the full version of the game, which is odd because I'm positive I never purchased this thing. Like I said, I only had the demo, and I didn't play enough of it for me to pull the trigger on actually buying it. Well, whatever the reason, I found that super interesting, and it pretty much cemented the fact that I absolutely had to cover Dreadout today, and now that I played a good portion of it, I've got some mixed feelings. Dreadout puts you in the shoes of Linda Melinda, owner of one hell of a funny name and member of some kind of a class trip that is currently going tits up. The teacher in charge seems to have taken a few wrong turns, and the group finds themselves at a blocked-off bridge, which obviously means they should sidestep those barriers and explore what's on the other side. And yes, that ghost pun was very much intended. So our group splits up and finds out this is an entire-ass town that seems to have just been up and abandoned. They all decide to meet at a school towards the center of town, and when one of them fails to meet back up with the group, all hell breaks loose. All the doors in the school slam shut, and Linda's best friend starts to act like she's possessed. Everything fades to black, and when Linda wakes up, she's the only one left. So from here on out, the goal is to get the hell out of Dodge, and if she can find her friends, that'd be nice too. The themes in the story here very much follow its inspiration Fatal Frame, but everything gets painted with a very Indonesian folklore kind of brush, and maybe you could argue that would lessen the scares a bit, but I didn't find that to be the case at all. In fact, I'd say it only enhanced them. The monsters and cultural practices referenced here were totally foreign to me, and not knowing what the hell was going on really helped me feel just as lost and confused as the character I was controlling. I'm sure there were a few aha moments I missed out on by knowing literally nothing about Indonesian superstition, but that's what we like to call in this business an acceptable loss. Well, so far so good, huh? The story is a little spook fest filled with ghosts, abandoned towns, and giant pigs with human faces. All the landmarks of a fun time. Well, not exactly. I'm sure most of you have noticed by now, but rough around the edges doesn't even come close to describing this game. Now, I want to be very clear here. Dreadout as a concept is really damn cool. Not only is Fatal Frame a great source of inspiration, but I love the idea that a small team of 20 developers were able to raise funds for a cool horror game in a market that's like 99.9% mobile titles. It's a success story to be sure, but there are a few things that are very clear from the start. These guys were either very new to game development, were severely underfunded, or some combination of the two, because Dreadout is, well, like I said, rough around the edges would be a massive understatement. Nearly every aspect of the game just screams a lack of know-how, and it's not just graphical glitches, although there's plenty of those as well. A lot of ideas here are great on paper, but they just aren't executed very well. For example, the game can be very vague in letting you know where it would like you to go next, and yes, this genre is not about constant hand-holding, but anyone who's played this thing will know what I'm talking about. In the first real section of the school, I picked up several items and had no idea if these were needed to move forward or usable items, and the inventory did not help at all. All I could do was look at them. I couldn't equip them or use them, and trying to select them with the controller's analog stick would move around portions of the on-screen user interface, so that was fun. Sometimes the game would expect me to return to a previous point when there was no indication I should do that, and often I would miss important items because the indicator that you can pick something up gets activated when you're right on top of the item and goes away as soon as you're out of range. Also, the game has an interesting system where the screen will have a blue vignette when there's something that can be used or examined nearby, and a red one when there's danger, but often the blue effect would happen in spots where there was just flat out nothing to do. No pictures could be taken, and there were no items to find. Well, later I would find out that this happens when you're also underneath an item or point of interest, so I'd be walking around on the first floor being made aware of cool stuff to see on the floor above me. Of course, these are all little tweaks that a veteran game designer would know to account for, but someone new to this could understandably miss. And in that same vein, the game's combat, while pretty close to its inspiration, can be a little amateur. Knockback and stun from attacks don't have enough of an effect on enemies, and where you need to aim in order to register as a hit is still unclear to me. Sometimes it's dead center, sometimes it's the head, there's just no consistency. There's also not much of a cooldown in between shots, so there's nothing really stopping you from just mashing the button till the ghost is dead. And of course, there's the expected bad English dialogue, but I feel like if anything, that's more true to the genre, so definitely no complaints there. Alright, so despite all of that, I can't exactly tell you I didn't enjoy my time with Dreadout. It seems like underneath the developmental mistakes and clear budgetary limitations beats the heart of a well-designed survival horror game. There are these big indoor environments with a bunch of rooms that'll need unlocking, and more importantly, the atmosphere is just masterfully done. Early on in the game, I figured out that you can't really die but instead get transported to this purgatory place until you counterintuitively run into the light, and you'd think not being able to die would have an adverse effect on how scared the game made me, but it was still able to creep me out. This game kept me spooked and enjoying myself despite the absolute mess the gameplay could be. I don't know, it's kind of hard to describe, but I could really feel the heart behind this project. On paper, they failed it a lot here, and I'm not trying to be mean, but objectively, there's more wrong with this game than right. But as you play, you really get the feeling this was a project born out of love and determination. Honestly, I'm not really sure I've ever felt this way about a game before. It was kind of like every time it stumbled, instead of being frustrated, I was just rooting for it to pick itself back up and try again. And while researching this segment of the video, I was genuinely happy to find out that's exactly what they did.
Wanna come?
Maybe later.
Okay, you're lost.
Ah, she finally decided to show up. Let's get this vengeance party started!
After the relative success of Dreadout, Indonesian dev house Digital Happiness seemed to really get the recognition they deserved. When they made the first game, they had issues securing funding thanks to the Indonesian market being mostly mobile games at the time, but now they're riding relatively high. Hell, they even made a Dreadout movie, and it actually looks really cool. They also produced what is essentially a new campaign for the first game, but what I was most excited to see is that they dropped an honest-to-goodness sequel in 2020, and holy hell does it leave the original in its dust. Dreadout 2 starts out basically where the last one left off. Linda's back in the world of the living, and without giving anything away, let's just say a few of her classmates weren't quite so lucky. Now that she's back, the rest of the kids at school bully the hell out of her, blaming Linda for everything that went down that night. The game starts during a particularly rough incident where a few classmates have locked Linda in a closet, burned her belongings, and taken part in some kind of a ritual that's supposed to curse her, and while I haven't finished the story yet, it seems like it may have worked. Since she was involved in the hell that went down in that abandoned city, she has a bit of a connection to the other side and more importantly, the means to fight it. During one of her typical now trips to the realm of the dead, Linda appears to be possessed, and that's where things really start. After this, Linda is constantly harassed by ghosts and old wives' tales alike until she goes on the offensive trying to figure out what's in her and how to get it the hell out. And keeping with a theme you might notice going forward, the story here seems much more solid and well put together. Of course, that's not to say the story in the first game was bad, but for lack of a better word, it was pretty boilerplate. Almost a beat-for-beat reimagining of the first Fatal Frame. Here in the sequel, it seems like things go a lot deeper, delving into Linda's past, and the game does a great job of introducing figures that play a larger role in her life. The world of Dreadout 2 is just flat out bigger and includes many more key players than the original. Plus, there's a lot of side content in the story, like this one ghost who used to love street racing when he was alive, and all it took to get him to quit running over pedestrians with his souped-up ghost bike was to hear him out and let him get some stuff off his chest. Once again, the theme of Indonesian folklore is most of what drives the experience here, and as someone who knows less than nothing on the subject, I can confidently tell you you don't need to be in the know in order to get spooked out by it. In fact, like I said before, it might actually help the scares be more effective. On top of that, there's always this feeling that you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg anytime you come across a ghost or hear something offhand in the game's dialogue. I don't know, it's just always cool when things in a video game have meaning, even when you don't necessarily know what that meaning is. As far as gameplay is concerned, you could definitely argue that things are a little different here. I mean, there's a lot of new stuff to do, but that's the key word there, new. You don't lose anything you might have liked from the first game, there's just other stuff to do as well. For example, in Dreadout 1, there was a big town to escape from, and that required going into smaller interior locations and finding your way through them in a way that led you closer to your goal. And that's still the case here, only those smaller locations are now reached via a hub area. And your little hometown, aside from being impressively lively as the game goes on, ends up being a really cool hub where you can talk to locals and get an idea of where you want to go next, which solves one of my issues with the first game. Once you find yourself in a haunted location, which is very often, you'll start to see the little improvements that lead to this sequel feeling like it was made several console generations after the first. Of course, you're still going to be key hunting while using your phone to snap pics of the dead, but they've also thrown in a melee combat component for dealing with demonic enemies and other more tangible threats. And while this system may be pretty basic, it works really well and overall feels like a natural addition to the original game's framework. Now here's one hell of a good thing to note. The menu is now an actual asset you can take advantage of instead of the barely functional mess it was before, and while I would still prefer an in-game map to be viewable, I found myself intuiting where I needed to go a lot this time around. Honestly, if I just sat here listing improvements over the first game, we'd be here for hours. It seems like every single element from the original Dreadout was not only brought over, but noticeably improved. Everything from controls to the camera and exploration all just feel like they've been tweaked subtly to feel better and more precise. It's like all of Dreadout's elements just fit together more solidly, and all of these small tweaks make for a game that plays drastically better than the first. I mean, it's almost unbelievable that the same team made both games. When I first booted up Part 2, I had a big smile on my face, sort of like I just watched a friend succeed at something. I was pulling for them so hard in the first game, and it's just awesome to see the guys at Digital Happiness fix the issues in their previous release and improve on that formula this much. Now, having said all of that, I don't want to give you the wrong idea. In the context of coming from Dreadout 1 to Part 2, it's like a whole new world in terms of quality, but as a general video game, this is still very much an indie title. You're going to run into small issues all over, and there's still an air of amateur game design about the entire experience. Something made very evident when checking your notepad to see where you need to go next and finding only a single entry labeled story as the goal. Now personally, I would have preferred something a little more vague, like maybe beat the game, but hey, there's always Part 3, right? I truly can't tell you guys how happy I am to see this new resurgence of classic survival horror game design, and if you ask me, it's happening in the one and only place it ever could, the indie sector. A place where corporate interference and focus testing flat out don't exist, where experimentation and innovation still hold sway, and in those terms, there is nothing more indie than a single developer being inspired by the horror games of old and releasing a small taste of what they'd like to bring to the modern gaming landscape. Post-Trauma is a brand new survival horror game being developed by Roberto Serra, and I'm going to warn you ahead of time, this is not going to take long to cover, as it is a pretty small vertical slice of what he's been up to. But I'll go ahead and say this right now, if this is even a portion of what we can expect from the finished product, I am very excited to see what we end up with. Post-Trauma's demo drops you straight into the action as a 57-year-old man who might want to start considering a low-carb diet. Our guy's having a pretty shitty day as he woke up on a train he doesn't remember getting on, and to say some strange stuff has gone down in the meantime would be underselling the situation. There's a padlock on one exit and a Lovecraftian nightmare of horrors on the other, so you're basically stuck in this train until you solve a really awesome puzzle that has you looking at several torn up line maps to get values for each train line and adding them together when necessary. Once you're out of the train, you'll head down a tunnel which ends in the absolute worst visual you will ever want to come across in a dark space, and turning back will have you solving a few adventure game type use X item on Y object puzzles. And the imagery all along the way is just a masterwork. Your environment feels very Silent Hill in its design, and by that I mean a real-life location that has suddenly been plunged into the depths of hell. Oh, and there's also a save room, and yes, that does mean it includes a soothing save room theme, which is always a plus in these type of games. After solving a really cool puzzle that sees you turning mannequins or actual living beings, I'm not quite sure, you enter into combat with the demo's only tangible enemy, and it's... well, it works, but let's just say it could be better. After that, you'll have a few items on you that will allow you to progress to the end section, where you enter through a doorway that seems promising since it leads to the most amount of light you've seen in this entire demo. But just as you cross that threshold, the whole thing ends. And I've gotta say, I don't think I've ever been quite so intrigued by a demo. This thing really gives you the idea that this guy understands what makes these games work so well. The atmosphere is stellar, and you get an awesome feeling of isolation, which is really impressive because I get the feeling there are a lot of placeholder assets being used here, at the very least unfinished ones. Starting this bad boy up, you'll be greeted with a warning that this isn't going to be representative of the final product, but goddamn I hope that's wrong, because I'm really excited to see what a finished version of what I just played looks like. Now, I've been very positive so far, and for good reason, but realistically there is a lot here I don't like, and I'll talk about most of that, but do keep in mind this is a very rough build of what this developer is working on, so take all of this with a grain of salt. First off, and most annoying, is this overlay that makes the game look like it's being projected onto a tile wall. Now don't get me wrong, I appreciate the symbolism, since all of this does take place in a train station with tiled walls, but it just looks bad in my opinion and covers up what is a really striking look. I'm not real sure why, but I've just never been a fan of these kinds of overlays in horror games, and if this does make it into the final product, it'd be nice to have a toggle on the options menu to get rid of it. So there's a run button, which is always nice, but it uses up stamina a little too fast for my liking and only increases your speed an almost imperceptible amount over the normal walk speed. Although I did find that you could move just as fast and not use stamina by just mashing the run button real fast like in GTA. A practical solution on paper, but it makes you look like this while moving, so maybe it doesn't work quite so well. In a finished version, it'd be nice to see a change here, like maybe keeping the system where attacks cost stamina, but just let the player run all they want. Some 3D models might look a little cheesy, and there may be a few spelling errors to iron out, but I can firmly say the enemy design and overall look to the monsters needs no tweaking. You get a sort of mix of Silent Hill's body horror approach, but with more of a demonic feel, and the result is really awesome. Now this is a big one. The controls can be very awkward, especially in the one and only fight in the demo, but I do think there's an easy fix for that. Maybe keep the analog-driven 3D control scheme for newbies, but add a proper tank control method for people with, let's say, refined palates. To balance that complaint though, I will say the camera here is sheer perfection. It follows the player around but on fixed paths, which is an awesome compromise between the stationary pre-rendered look and a more dynamic camera system. This way the developer gets the absolute control over how every scene can be viewed that you get with a survival horror game, but the player doesn't have to navigate that game via a series of still screens. A nice compromise, I'd say. Like I briefly touched on before, the puzzles here work really well. I'd say they strike a nice balance between being hard enough that I didn't breeze through them, but solvable enough that I didn't have to sit for 20 minutes trying to figure them out or look up some kind of an online guide. Now sure, that might not be the same case for everyone, but if this demo is any indication, I think the puzzles in the finished game are going to be really awesome. And honestly, I could talk way longer about this thing, but likely I've already shown you all of my captured footage 3 times over by now, so I'm going to go ahead and end the preview here. This being such an early look at work in progress, obviously it's going to be rough around the edges, but I am fully confident this guy is capable of delivering an incredible modern survival horror experience, which is something I think we can all agree is sorely needed right now. Out of all the games we've covered so far, I would say this one is particularly important. Tormented Souls showed up on my radar thanks to a buttload of people suggesting it to me, and like I said in the intro, I was not what you would call confident in the concept of modern survival horror. But I didn't exactly have anything better to do, so I bought myself a copy and tried it out, and I wasn't a full 20 minutes into the game before I figured out I was in love. There were tank controls, a fixed perspective, puzzles, backtracking-laden exploration, item hunting, and a heavy emphasis on resource conservation. It honestly felt like this game was made specifically for me. More importantly though, it was this exact game that inspired me to dive into a genre I was all but sure was dead, leading to the creation of this video. Now, I already covered this little gem on my channel a while back, so I'm going to try not to spend too much time reiterating myself here, but let me give you the basics. You play as Caroline, a girl going about her everyday life when she gets a letter in the mail from a Canadian hospital containing a picture of some twins and an ominous message. Having nothing much else on her plate at the moment, she decides to check the place out in hopes of figuring out why she gets this sharp pain and odd feeling every time she looks at the picture. And right about here is where a lesser YouTuber would reach for some low-hanging fruit, like maybe making a joke about the real horror in this game coming from the fact that you spend all your time dealing with the Canadian healthcare system. No, not me though. What I choose to do is make a joke about how someone else would make that joke, so it's in your head already and I may as well have made it. It's genius. Anyways, Caroline shows up to the hospital and isn't there more than a few minutes till she gets mollywopped upside the head, knocking her out. She wakes up sometime later not only naked but sans one eye, which you gotta figure is a really rough way to wake up. The rest of the game is spent unraveling the mystery of this hospital, the things that went down here, and who the hell up and stole her damn eyeball. I won't say much more than that here, but if you're looking to dig a little deeper, I'll have a link in the corner and in the description leading you to my full video on TS. As far as gameplay is concerned, things are just like I said before. This is flat out exactly what survival horror heads are going to want from a new game. It sticks insanely close to the tenets of the genre, even when that means using what some people might consider outdated mechanics. Speaking of which, you control Caroline with tank controls, and everything from her movement speed to her animations make that process an absolute dream. If you want, you can use the analog stick for a more quote-unquote modern style of control, but trust me, you're going to want to go with the D-pad here. It just matches the aesthetic and the overall atmosphere of the game perfectly. Combat's handled just like you'd expect, with you holding a shoulder button while hitting the action button to shoot, and it works exactly as well as it used to back in the PS1 era. And here's a fun little tip. I found a method that really helped conserve ammo by downing an enemy with a few shots from the starting pistol equivalent, which is a nail gun. Awesome. Anyways, then you head into your inventory screen, switch to a melee weapon, and get a few hits in while they're on the ground. It's a little annoying, I'll admit, but it's not like it's a necessary strategy or anything, just something to help crazy people like myself. You know, the kind that feel actual real-world guilt when they use too much ammo in one of these games.
Father, what's going on here? Why is that weird man walking around the operating table with that weird chandelier in his hands?
What are you talking about, child? I don't see anything.
Progression is very Resident Evil-esque, with you always on the lookout for new keys or items that might be used to solve some kind of a puzzle. Each new door leads to a new unexplored area of the hospital, and subsequently, more doors that need to be unlocked. It's all just perfectly survival horror, and for those of you paradoxically watching this video but not too sure what that means, I think I said it best in my video covering TS last year, which is the real draw here and really for all games in this genre. In a title like this, it's not so much about being mechanically skilled at the game, that is to say pushing the right buttons at exactly the right time, but instead it's about planning and execution. It's not about following a waypoint on your map to an enemy encounter and then having your skills be the only determining factor for whether or not you proceed. It's more about finding a porcelain hand and remembering, oh yeah, that's right, there's a door in that hallway that requires a knocker. And at that point, the next 10 minutes of the game is basically played inside your mind. You gotta ask yourself questions like, what items do I have with me? Are there any enemies on my route? And if I do get jumped, would I rather spend resources to heal myself after a risky dodge or on ammo used to engage in combat? Like I've said before, this genre as a whole is based on puzzle solving, and just getting from point A to point B can certainly be approached the same way you would any other puzzle. And if you ask me, this style of exploration is the element Tormented Souls nails best. Well said, Past Jared. Anyways, hopefully that clears things up. Tormented Souls is a knockout punch for people like me who've been dying for this genre to come back. It does everything a fan of survival horror would want, and all with a level of polish you just cannot deny given the circumstances. I mean, just look at these backgrounds. An indie dev made these. That's crazy. I'm just going to come out and say it. This is exactly how the RE2 and 3 remakes should have looked and played, and this game proves that it would have worked. This game is an absolute blast for old fogies like me that lived through the 90s, but hopefully it's shown a lot of you guys the light and started you down a path of seeking out more titles like this. If not, I don't know, maybe let's hope this video might. Alright, cards on the table. I usually like to end these little segments with something witty, but really and truly, Tormented Souls is just the highest recommendation I could give. No fluff, no flowery language, this is just flat out a game that needs to be played if you're watching this, so stop what you're doing and figure out a way to play it ASAP. Them and Us is an interesting little modern survival horror game that viewers of the channel have been asking me about for a while, and so I figured I'd download the demo and see what all the fuss was about. And I can't really say why, but for whatever reason it just did not rub me the right way back then. I'm not really sure if its developer, Tendo Games, made any updates to the way it looks and feels, or if I was just in a bad mood that day, but I came away from this game with a pretty bad taste in my mouth. So I'll admit, when it came time to give it another shot for this video, I wasn't exactly excited, but I'll be damned if it didn't win me over almost immediately. These guys clearly know their stuff where survival horror is concerned, because Them and Us plays like one of the greats. It focuses on exploration through item hunting and puzzle solving, puts an emphasis on tough combat seen through the lens of a classic survival horror framework, and as a cool little bonus, quick turning is activated the same way it is in RE, so that's muscle memory that won't go to waste. And as a fun little surprise, right here at the intro screen, I've already got something cool to talk about. Them and Us lets you choose between an RE4-like over-the-shoulder third-person camera and a more RE1-inspired fixed camera system, and well, I don't think I need to inform anyone which one I ended up going with. This demo starts out with an initial story dump that sees us in the shoes of Alisa Walker, a woman who's been in some kind of mental hospital for nearly a decade. She makes it seem like it's the doctors and med cocktails that's ripping her sanity away, but to be fair, I'd wager most people in a psych ward would say the same thing. Apparently, she used to be a medic of some kind and lost her daughter to some ailment. She struggles with not being able to heal the one person that means the most to her, but says she's on the road to discovering just what went down with her daughter, so I guess there's some kind of mystery to be solved within what seems to be a pretty open and shut case.
My own fate has placed me squarely on the path to finding her.
Now, we may not know what she's actually in for, but we do know that she's up for a prison transfer, which in video game terms means she's guaranteed to be the lone survivor of a bus crash. Now, this next cutscene, while really cool, is in a pretty weird spot for me. On one hand, it's in a totally different art style than what we were just looking at, so that's kind of off-putting, but on top of that, it's also interlaced, so we get to look at some sweet combing artifacts while we're watching it. Alright, dumb stuff aside, our girl wakes up to a skirmish that already seems to be at its apex, and I get proven to be clairvoyant once again. Alicia limps around trying to get away, but passes out from her injuries not too far away from the site of the crash. While being transported by boat by someone we don't know to somewhere we can't see, Alicia goes in and out of consciousness, and then she wakes up in a strange bed located within an even stranger mansion. And I swear I won't do this again, but just so you guys don't also spend way too long in this room, your knife can both be used and equipped. We'll just leave it at that. After figuring that out, we're given a low effort but much appreciated tutorial screen, and then we're free to explore this creepy ass mansion. And it won't take more than a few minutes of gameplay before you figure out that you are playing a genuine, real deal survival horror title. We've got tank controls, inventory management, item and environmental based puzzles, loads of exploration requiring an even greater amount of backtracking, and of course an absolute infinite amount of locked doors. As I was taking my first steps in the game, I just found myself nodding my head in agreement, like they were checking off items in my own personal survival horror checklist. Which really shows that the dev team not only used classic entries in the genre as inspiration, but also understood enough about those games to really get the little elements that need to come together in order for a new title to give off that same authentic feel. I mean, even when I had an initial complaint, it ended up getting remedied almost immediately. See, I was ready to start complaining about how annoying it was that I only had 2 spare inventory slots, but a few rooms down from my starting location I found a backpack that brought that number up to the standard 6. But while I was struggling with those 2 initial inventory slots, I found an element I never thought I'd see in one of these games again. These guys took the ability to drop items right where you stand and recollect them whenever you want from RE0, and that immediately put a smile on my face. Not only is that a game that I've always thought was criminally underrated, but that system specifically always struck me as a natural evolution of the classic RE framework. And speaking of RE, we not only have a callback to the first zombie reveal, but also the one in the bathroom from Remake, which never gets enough love. And since we're on the subject, zombies are the only enemies you'll come across in this demo, and I'd say they act exactly like you would expect from the genre. It takes a little while till you get your hands on your first firearm, so you're either going to have to get good at knifing or dodging, and by the way, I know I said I wouldn't do this again, but another slight hint. This display case right here can be moved if you examine it from behind and only from behind. I'm not going to ruin the rest of the puzzle, but trust me, that's going to save you at least a few minutes of fruitless searching. May or may not have figured this out right at the end of the demo and never got a chance to fire this thing once. Missed opportunities aside though, I really enjoyed how faithful Them and Us is to the tenets of survival horror. It's really refreshing to see, even in the context of a list of other games that's also doing that. You probably noticed I've been showering this game with praise so far, and to be fair, I do mean every word, but I put all the compliments up front to soften the blow because I've got a lot of complaints as well. And honestly, if you've had your eyes open up to this point, you've probably noticed most of them. This is an indie project created in Unreal 3, and while Tendo Games have made a title as true to the genre as their name is hard to Google, it's still incredibly rough around the edges. The main character will turn her head to look at objects of interest in the environment, which is awesome, but I think this could have used a little more tweaking because she does it for points of interest that are pretty far away, and when there's a few in a room together, the poor girl nearly breaks her own neck to look at them all. While the models for zombies look really good at a distance, and even when you're shining your flashlight directly at them, they have very basic animations that start and stop in a pretty jerky way. Although I will say the way they ragdoll on death actually looks really cool. The inventory screen, while looking very true to the genre, does seem like it's lacking a little visual flair. I mean, it's perfectly laid out, but it could have used a little more personality, I think. Throughout the game, you'll come across truly impressive lighting that'll have you thinking a much larger team worked on it, but then you'll also see bloom and god rays that are far too overpowering, and it'll remind you, yeah, it's an indie game. The camera system is akin to the kind of stuff we saw in the latter days of the genre, with it remaining locked in perspective but tracking the player on a fixed course. So when you're exploring the environment, you get these really great looking sweeping shots that really sell the old school aesthetic while still improving on it. Like I said before, this is probably the best compromise we could have between old school survival horror fans and people who want to control their cameras. A little bit of both camps, if you will. Anyways, getting to the actual problem, sometimes the camera movement can present a bit of judder, kind of like the game's dropping frames. Now it's not always present, but when it shows up, it's really annoying. And before you ask, without bragging, trust me, my specs are more than up to par with what this game might be demanding. On the plus side though, these environments look absolutely pristine. I mean, just truly impressive. But with all that fidelity, we run into a similar problem that Tormented Souls faced, where the backgrounds look so damn good it draws attention to the more amateur-looking main character. And lastly, for a game that, like I said, is really impressive but very rough around the edges, I think a price tag of $40 does sort of sting. Now don't get me wrong, if the game continues to deliver on its initial survival horror goodness, I am more than willing to cough up a little extra scratch, but for a dev house that only has one title to its name, I think a lower price point would likely lead to more success. But that being said, Them and Us definitely intrigued me, so I ponied up the 40 wing wangs and added it to the old library. This thing most definitely has an insanely promising start, and I'm really interested to see if it can keep that pace up. Maybe be on the lookout for a video in the future showcasing my findings, but until then there's no reason you shouldn't head to Steam right now and download the free demo. This thing gets a whole lot right and stays staggeringly true to a dead genre, which I think is more than deserving of a test drive. Well, every video like this needs its wild card, something that bucks a trend or defies expectation, and I'd say Evil Tonight most definitely fits that mold. Now, I'm sure some of you are probably getting ready to leave a comment on this video calling me a hypocrite. After all, I often say that visual elements are a part of the survival horror genre, and well, this is about as visually far from Resident Evil as you could possibly get. And sure, maybe there's some truth there, but a top-down perspective that isn't directly controlled by the player sits a little closer to a fixed camera system than you might think. I mean, games like Code Veronica and Dino Crisis use a similar moving camera that also follows the player, and I'd say those two stay true to their roots. But more importantly, B, you're just gonna have to trust me on this one. This game stays faithful to the genre in almost every single other way, despite it looking more like Seiken Densetsu than Biohazard. But before we go down that road, let's talk about story, which is definitely something a little outside of survival horror's typical realm. The game starts by introducing us to our characters who don't have much time to shine here but still end up coming off as likable and kind of funny. You play as Sylvia, an exorcist who's obsessed with the concept of all men in the world wanting to date her, which is essentially both members of Dirty Pair put together. And right off the bat, the story has a very cool en medias res kind of thing going on, with its events setting up a flashback, and that flashback is what you end up playing through. Sylvia was apparently hired to cleanse an evil presence from a performing arts school, and how she goes about doing that is transporting the whole place into a kind of spirit realm where these things can manifest themselves into reality. In the process of exploring the place, Sylvia comes across a group of kids who just so happen to be in the area during her ritual, and as a result got sucked into this weird ghost realm with her. So on top of finding the vengeful ghost that haunts the school and convincing her to move on, she's got to reunite this friend group and keep them from getting killed. Even though you have these other characters to talk to throughout the story, most of your interactions are going to be Sylvia talking to Sylvia. And the good news is she's an interesting character. The writing really does a great job of keeping her funny and endearing. As you progress through the main story, you come across diary entries from the girl who died and now haunts the place, and it becomes this nice little side content. It's delved out in your typical RE method, that being files you find as you explore, and it's a nice little tale that starts off with a bit of mystery. So the story here is definitely up to snuff in my opinion, and sets itself apart from most survival horror games by being funny on purpose and not through some poorly written dialogue. However, a game in this genre can't stand up on narrative alone, and that means I get to talk about the most interesting part of this little sprite-based experience. And just so you know, I've been racking my brain trying to think of all the little bits of Evil Tonight that makes it feel so true to survival horror, but I think the point lies therein. It just feels like an entry in the genre. I mean, sure, there are definitely tangible elements I can point to, and believe me, I will, but I think in getting all analytical with video games here on this channel, I might be missing out on some of the more important aspects of the medium. You know, maybe sometimes it's not all about what you can prove to an audience, and more about what you felt while playing a game. And while playing what is essentially a SNES-era action RPG, I felt the heart of a survival horror game beating within it. Evil Tonight has you exploring a big spooky location that starts out very tight and localized, until enough item collecting, puzzle solving, and backtracking opens up more areas to explore, and thus more backtracking, puzzle solving, and item hunting. You guys know the deal. It's an experience I'm sure most of you have had before, but it's hiding under the veneer of a top-down 2D game, which is really interesting. And man, I really need to express how accurately these guys hit the mark with this thing. The puzzles feel challenging as hell, but it's the kind of challenge that has you getting a little frustrated and then looking around in desperation, only to find that the hint you needed was right there in the environment the whole time, aka exactly what the genre is known for. As usual, most doors in the place are locked, and like you'd expect, finally finding a key to that one door in the starting area you've been wondering about the entire game is insanely satisfying. In an odd choice I started out hating but ended up really appreciating, Evil Tonight includes no in-game map. And believe me, this is no small environment. It can be very easy to get lost here, but as you explore, you get more and more familiar with the place, and eventually I was navigating with ease. And I'm dead serious about that. That really started out as a major complaint of mine for the first hour of the game, but as I played more, it became more and more of a compliment. On the plus side, instead of having you examine every single door in the school and having you wait through an infinite amount of dialogue boxes, coming near a door will pop up an icon of the key you need to open it. Something I think more games in the genre could definitely use. Now, I'm sure by this point you guys are wondering about combat, and oddly enough, it works eerily similar to any other game in the genre. Holding a trigger will ready your weapon, and hitting the action button fires it. Pretty simple. You can also press the run button while aiming for a quick melee attack, and I found most of my time was spent knifing enemies to death using ammo sparingly, a tactic I am more than a little familiar with. And sure, maybe I could have gotten through most encounters way easier and way faster if I would have used my guns more, but there is at least a small portion of the crowd who will 100% understand why I couldn't live with myself if I did that. Which further fuels why I think this game sticks so close to the genre even when it looks so radically different. But speaking of looks, have you guys seen how damn good this sprite art is? I mean, for real, this thing looks mouth-wateringly good. Every single asset in Evil Tonight is just gorgeous, and on top of the raw pixel artistry, there are these cool lighting and fog effects layered over top. The environment is just beautifully crafted, and while it is sort of hard to be spooked out by a faux 16-bit look, I think this game is probably as close as any 2D game will get to being scary. The style of monsters and characters alike is definitely aligned more on the anime side of the spectrum, but come on, super deformed anime proportions and pixel art just go hand in hand. I really couldn't imagine it looking any different. All the items in the game have great looking sprites drawn up for them, but if you ask me, the animations are the real star of the show here. Everything from idle stances to attacks have a very fluid feel to them, and that really adds to how satisfying the gameplay is. And I'm very happy to say the music is also spot on for the genre. Really and truly, this whole thing is just an amazing package. I cannot recommend it enough. Evil Tonight is an amazing tribute to all the tenets of classic survival horror and stays more true to the Resident Evil side of things than its visuals would have you believe. Basically what I'm saying is, avoid this game if you're into not having fun and being lame. For the rest of you, get out there and drop a few bucks on one of the best games I played in a good long while. I figure a perfect way to start this thing off is with the game I think I may be in love with. Signalis is a top-down, voxel-based, maybe, survival horror title developed by Rose Engine, and the ties to Resident Evil may as well be neon-lit in this game, which is fitting because it has a very dark cyberpunk sort of aesthetic to it. For me, I get a very Ergo Proxy by way of Dead Space kind of vibe, or if you want to get real nerdy, it looks like it was somehow created by Tsutomu Nihei. But I'll go ahead and warn you up front, this is not going to be a very long overview since the game is yet to come out and all we really have is this brief demo showing off some basic but very promising gameplay elements. Signalis is the story of Elster, who I think is some kind of a cyborg robot type of deal. She gets a signal waking her up and comes to find the ship she was on derelict in some snowy wasteland and the crew nowhere to be found. On the plus side though, she's not alone. Terrifying creatures that tread a very thin line between Lovecraft and Giger seem to be hanging out, so that's nice. And as far as story goes, that's all we really know. Now there are a lot of hints at a much deeper cosmic horror kind of situation here, but the demo plays it real close to the vest, and I'm fine with that. Besides, if I had to guess, we're all here for the gameplay anyways, and that's good because this thing basically functions as a top-down survival horror game. You'll traverse the environment solving puzzles, collecting items, managing your limited inventory, and fighting or running from foes, which will all be familiar elements if you're watching this video, but you just never change your view from that nearly isometric perspective. Well, I guess that's not entirely true. There are these first-person sections where you can examine things up close to find clues, which, by the way, the artistry going on here is just on another level. Like I said before, these appear to be voxels, but my 32-bit brain still sees this as a pixel-based image being scaled and rotated as if it were 3D, which will always just impress me, and honestly that goes for everything I've seen in this demo. The art is just mouth-watering with this mix of traditional pixel art and well-animated voxels. There's even a cool CRT effect that I likely won't ever use, but looks pretty damn convincing. The overall aesthetic, if you can't see it yourself, is a mix of dark cyberpunk, goth, and that 80s and 90s retro future type of approach that saw even people from far beyond our timeline still using cathode ray tubes for displays, which is really awesome. Combat may take a quick second to get used to, but after that it's pretty boilerplate. You take aim with the shoulder button, fire with a different shoulder button, and use a kick while the enemy's on the ground to make sure they stay that way. You know, Silent Hill rules. From what I can tell in this short glimpse, it's poised to be an absolute game of the year for me. Every single screen is just dripping with personality, and it doesn't help that they're using a gameplay style that bypasses my conscious thought and hits me straight in the lizard brain. Now, this isn't a sponsored ad or anything, it's just that damn good. I played through this demo late at night with the lights off and my headphones on, and it felt like I'd been transported back to my early teens. It really replicates that mystery and dark curiosity you likely felt when playing your first classic RE game. Listen, if you're gonna take one piece of advice from me this decade, make it this. Go to Steam, download this demo, and try it for yourself. Then wishlist it and sit in front of your computer refreshing the screen till Signalis is released. If it makes you feel any better, that's exactly what I'm gonna do. Okay, so for this one, we're dealing with more of a clerical error than an actual entry in the list, and I know that sounds strange, but follow me on this one. The Medium was sold to me, likely in the same way it was sold to you, as a game going after that classic survival horror standard. Not long after launch, I remember hearing a lot of rumblings about this thing being similar to Silent Hill, something that is interestingly both true and untrue at the same time. But regardless, I figured I would check it out. After all, I'm on a modern survival horror kick, why not grab what seems to be the largest budget title I've looked at so far? Oh, and by the way, right now this game's on sale over at goodoldgames.com with a pretty significant price cut, so if you want to check that out, check the link in the description. Well, I'm not going to hold you guys in suspense. This game is not survival horror. It does not attempt to clone Resident Evil or Silent Hill in any gameplay or design sense, so I guess the question is, why have it on the list? Well, I think there's enough raw material here to work with that I could at the very least draw a few similarities.
Cover your nose. Try not to look at him. The sooner we're done, the sooner we can get out of this place.
Definitely didn't need to feel that.
I started playing the Medium last week to get footage and almost immediately knew it was not fit for this video, but then something happened. I just kept playing it. I really got into its story and, more importantly, how it went about delivering it, so indulge me for a bit. I promise this is all going somewhere. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Medium's narrative a little bit, and then we'll cover what elements it shares with survival horror games, if there are any to cover, that is. And I'll tell you right off the bat, this game starts off with one hell of an emotional opening. Our main character Marianne has just lost her adopted father, a man that played a huge role in her life, and we take control of her as she dresses his body for the funeral. Through some inner monologue and scattered documents, we find out that our girl here has a few standout features to her character that might come up in a job interview. First off, she suffered intense burns across a large portion of her body at a young age. Second, she was a foster kid and bounced back and forth between families until she met the father figure she's getting ready to bury today. And third, a slight addendum here, she might have the ability to see into the other side.
No wonder people used to think I was strange. If they only knew.
She can speak with spirits and interact with the afterlife, and this comes with quite a few related abilities. After being forced into a situation where she has to help her own father figure pass on to the other side, she's contacted by someone who seems to know what she can do and needs her help. He doesn't give much more info than that, and then the call gets cut off, and that's our inciting incident. Marianne hops on her motorcycle to find this guy at an old abandoned resort facility built back when Poland was a communist republic. Apparently, this place was a happening spot back in the day, but like most things built in, for, by, or around the general vicinity of communism, led to a terrible tragedy and mass loss of life. No one really knows what happened here thanks to a government cover-up, and as you start to explore, you get the feeling that Marianne's mystery caller and this place's sordid history might be two sides of the same coin. The Medium certainly doesn't do anything wildly new or different with its story, but it's compelling and, at least to me, infinitely interesting. It dabbles in all kinds of cool elements. You've got the mystery surrounding a whole lot of dead people that a communist-era government swept under the rug, supernatural elements like ghosts and echoes of suffering left behind, and then there's Marianne herself, a character that I found relatable and endearing right from the start. She's not a wild card or some loud example of a stereotype you typically see in lazy story writing. She's sort of quiet, introspective, and strikes a nice balance between being emotionally affected by what she's going through, but not overwhelmed by it all. After all, she's seen through to the other side of reality, and that gives her a very interesting perspective on things. Now, I've yet to fully complete the Medium story, but I did do a little cursory review hunting, and it seems like people tend to go either way on this one. Some people enjoy the story, but I've seen a lot who find it boring. Now, of course, this is going to be the most subjective part of any critique, but I found this to be a surprisingly engrossing story. It hit a lot of my buttons, I guess. I love a nice spooky tale concerning ghosts and the supernatural, and I really like strong characters that have a good combination of blind resolve and cynicism. See Heather Mason. Then, of course, there's the looming mystery of what the hell went down in this resort. The game does a great job of stringing you along and only revealing just enough to partially answer 2 questions while posing an additional 3. Honestly, I give this one a massive thumbs up based just on the story it tells, but that's not going to mean very much if you don't like what I'm about to say next. The medium may not be a walking simulator, but it's enough like one that I could forgive you for thinking it was. Now, there are fail states and genuine elements that'll have you engaging with the game in a more mechanical sense than just moving around, but it's only just barely deeper than that. And cards on the table, I've never really minded a good walking simulator myself. Ever since the PS1 era, when I first started noticing game developers toying with more cinematic elements, I've been fine with the game taking a very linear, storytelling-focused approach. And that's exactly what you're going to get here. In fact, I'd say more than a walking simulator, the medium shares most of its DNA with point-and-click adventure games. You just have full control over your character here instead of using a cursor to move them around. Each area of the game will have you looking around for some kind of contrived way forward, and almost always that will require the solving of some kind of rudimentary puzzle. Of course, the solutions to those puzzles will vary, but they will rarely ever need you to go more than 2 or 3 rooms down before you've picked up what you need. Mostly, I found these head scratchers to be at best intuitive and at worst sort of insultingly easy, which isn't the worst thing in the world. Even though I actually get a pretty big kick out of puzzles and video games, I walk that fine line between enjoying it when they're challenging, but hating it when they stump me and I've got to halt all forward progress so I can spend the next 20 minutes arranging tarot cards on a door. Now, you do get a step up in complexity when you're allowed to start crossing over into the other world willingly, but even then, I doubt very much anyone watching with the ability to read will find a lot here that'll challenge you for more than a minute or two. And speaking of that, the medium has this really cool mechanic where you can control Marianne in both our world and the other world simultaneously. Both sides often have some element you're going to want to look out for, and this felt like a really cool idea. Maybe it doesn't get used to its full potential here, but it definitely spices things up when the game starts to drag a bit. And I'll be honest with you, that drag comes from the fact that there is no real combat in the medium to speak of. Marianne does have some assorted spirit powers she can call upon when she's absorbed energy, but instead of using this strategically, it's more often than not going to be treated like a puzzle, with you manipulating Marianne in both worlds in order to make some kind of a change that'll let her access that energy well. And I'm sure some of you guys know how I feel about non-combat horror games. Now, they definitely have their place, but that place is certainly not within the survival horror genre, which leads me right to the argument at the start of this section. This game is in no way, shape, or form survival horror, and that is just flat out not up for debate. I don't care what online rag you write video game reviews for. It includes absolutely no elements past exploration and puzzle solving that could be seen in something like Silent Hill or Resident Evil, and even those two elements are so light they almost don't count. To be fair to Bloober Team though, it doesn't even seem like they're the ones who said it's survival horror, or at the very least they haven't said it anywhere I can find. From what I can tell, it seems to be online reviewers perpetuating this myth, which I guess is par for the course in this industry. Like I said before, this is a narrative-driven adventure game, pure and simple. But I can understand making that mistake. After all, Resident Evil was spawned from Alone in the Dark, which was at its core an adventure game. You know, it seems like a bit of a travesty to me that modern gamers are so far removed from really awesome genres like the point-and-click adventure that when they get faced with one, they immediately have to say it's the most modern point of reference they can think of, which is the walking simulator. Anyways, getting back on the I can see why people would make that mistake topic, there are a lot of storytelling and surface level elements that were clearly borrowed from games like Silent Hill here. I mean, we do have a literal otherworld that Marianne is violently forced into at certain moments, and the rundown, dilapidated environment she's in certainly would fit in near Toluca Lake. And sure, as a fan of the genre, it is nice seeing these familiar pieces on the board again, but they're just not enough to justify the survival horror term populating so many online reviews of this game. On the plus side though, this is one hell of a looker. I mean, truly, it's hard to put into words how incredible this thing looks on a native 4K panel. Some areas in the game are bordering so hard on photorealism I genuinely assume the backgrounds were pre-rendered at one point. That being said, this amazing fidelity does come at a cost. Not only is the game hard capped at just 60 frames per second, but even with the GTX 3080 Ti and Ryzen 9 3900, an empty room can see the frame rate drop to around 40 FPS, and that is present even when dropping down to medium settings. And I'm going to go ahead and drop a hot take here. Even though your game is incredible to look at, I mean just jaw-dropping, maybe if it can't maintain 60 frames per second on medium settings with ray tracing disabled, all while running on one of the absolute most powerful consumer-grade GPUs on the market, you might have fucked up somewhere. But to be totally fair, this is not meant to be a graphical analysis, just an airing of grievances. The long story I'm looking to shorten here goes like this. No, the medium is not a survival horror game. It does share some cosmetic elements that you could argue comes from titles that belong to that genre, but it's not an RE clone. So why is it here on the list? Which I think might be the third time I've asked this question. Well, to put things simply, I started playing this game for the video, decided it wasn't right for the list, but got so wrapped up in it that I just kept going for hours and hours. So I need to both justify wasting time that could have been spent playing games that actually fit in with the thesis statement here, and recommend you guys check out a title that I think is genuinely amazing. I was truly smitten with a medium, and I get that it might not be for everyone, but if you watched this section and saw something you think you might get into, I'd really suggest checking it out. The story really worked its way under my skin, and the horror elements are pretty damn well done, but I promise from now on it'll be only games that fit the RE clone mold. Or not, I do most of this by the seat of my pants, but I swear I will make a genuine effort this time.
What the hell are you, Neva?
And now we're really getting into the juicy stuff. Conscript has been in development for a while now, and believe you me, I've been following that process like a hawk. Much like Signalis, this is a top-down attempt at recreating that Resident Evil magic, and also like Signalis, we've only got a demo to give us a taste of what we can expect. Amazingly, this thing's being put together by a single guy in Australia, and fun note, the soundtrack was made by the same guy who does all the music for my channel. Pretty damn cool having buds with both talent and good taste in video games. Alright, so right off the bat, I think you guys can tell this one is taking a bit of a different stab at the genre. This game takes place during the First World War, and you play as a French soldier trying to find his brother in a trench overrun with Germans. Things start out pretty bleak with our main character's unit already being thinned out pretty hard, and after a massive push by the enemy, we end up as one of the few surviving soldiers stuck inside the trench. And this took a while to dawn on me, but unlike, well, any other game I can think of in the survival horror genre, there are no supernatural or bioorganic threats here. No zombies or curses, no monsters, well, at least not in the traditional sense. No, instead of fantasy being used to create an air of horror, Conscript just puts you in an already terrifying situation and lets that do all the work. It's one that most would argue is the worst thing a person can go through, and I thought that was a really awesome way to approach such an old genre while still making sure to pay tribute to the foundations it was built on. The game has a thick and incredibly oppressive atmosphere despite the fact that it doesn't use any fantasy elements to add to the horror, and it keeps you just as on edge as any other games in its class. Oh, and speaking of games in its class, this is one hell of a true survival horror title as far as gameplay is concerned. Your enemies can really kick your ass in no time, and healing items are not easy to get a hold of. Combat requires you to hold a shoulder button and press the other to swing or shoot, but you can squeeze a little more damage and accuracy out of the attack by letting your reticle shrink before you let loose. And trust me, this is something you're going to want to get the hang of real early on. Combat in Conscript, while seemingly simple, can be incredibly punishing. At first I was getting killed a lot because these bad guys aren't exactly the shambling corpses I'm used to in the genre. They can run and will hunt you down if they see you. I started getting really good at firing my weapon, chambering another round, and using the stamina draining dodge move to get a little distance before finishing the job. If you've played these type of games before, you'll know spacing has always been important, but here it's on a whole new level, and I'll be honest, at first I was ready to criticize the game about this, but I ended up really liking it after I started to wrap my head around how it works. Taking advantage of the iframes when you dodge, and making sure you've loaded another round before you try to fire again in the heat of battle, it's all going to come to you eventually, but it can be a lot at first. Outside of combat, you'll be doing a lot of familiar tasks like picking up keys, clearing barricades, and overall just trying to unlock more of this nasty-ass environment to explore. I can't remember coming across any puzzles in the demo, but I've got to assume he's going to put some in the final release, or at least I'm hoping that's the case, because I'd love to see what he comes up with. And speaking of demos, this thing's probably only going to take you an hour or so to clear, so I may not be able to say too much more about how it plays, but I can say this. If the finished product is able to keep up this kind of pace, we've got an absolute classic on our hands. And to be totally honest with you, a lot of my love for this game comes from its interesting presentation. Not only is this one hell of a setting for a survival horror game, I mean, honestly, how did it take this long for someone to put World War I and Resident Evil together? But the narrow bit depth, low resolution pixel art, and color banding really sells the look. I mean, think about it. This is an old genre that, for good reason, never sees modernization, so it makes sense that a game that belongs in it would look appropriately old. All of the atrocities around you are traumatizing as it is, especially since you know they have real-life analogs, but the dirt and grit that comes from the low resolution just puts a gross bow on the whole package. You know, I'm starting to think I'm becoming a strictly 2D survival horror fan at this point. Okay, so I am overly excited for this game, but there are a few gripes that come to mind. At one point, I saved my game with my health on danger, and after dying and reloading that save, I noticed that it was at fine again, which I thought was weird but continued on anyways. Well, after that, I kept dying really easily, like in 1 or 2 hits, and I thought these enemies were just elites or something, but it turns out the game was just telling me I was at fine when in reality I needed to use a healing item. I also had a German soldier glide at me aggressively, which was pretty damn funny, but my biggest problem is one I think would be easily fixed. I've always been the type of guy who likes to turn off the heads-up display whenever possible, especially in a game like this where immersion is key, but in this game, I think the developer may have taken that idea a little too far. Whenever the HUD's off, you can no longer see what items you're picking up, and when swapping weapons using the D-pad as hotkeys, you have no idea what weapon you've changed to because they aren't visible on your character model until you take aim. If I had one humble request, it would be to strike a middle ground here. When the HUD is turned off, maybe get rid of the visible health and stamina meters, which are my biggest problem, but keep the short prompts that show what item you've just picked up and the icons that briefly let you know what weapon you've switched to and its available ammo. Now, this is a demo, and I'm sure we can expect more polish from the final release of the game, but even if that's not the case, we are still dealing with one hell of a good time here. I am eagerly awaiting Conscript's release, and if you're into classic survival horror done right, you should be too. It puts a really refreshing spin on a genre that I love, which is really saying a lot in the context of the unique titles included in this video, and it does it all while looking just beautiful. Well, I guess more accurately dark and desolate, but same thing, right? Song of Horror sort of came out of nowhere for me. I think the first time I really noticed it existed was in an Amazon ad banner. Well, I did a little research and saw a lot of people talking about old school survival horror, which to be fair more often than not means the opposite, but I decided to take a leap of faith and grab it on Steam. And I'll tell you this right off the bat, Song of Horror is genuinely scary. Now, if you're like me, you've seen a lot of these kind of games come and go, and that tends to desensitize you to the kind of tricks a horror title can pull to get under your skin. Well, that was my thought process anyways, and I was there thinking nothing could scare me out of my seat anymore, but that actually happened a few times while playing this game.
Let's see that in an instant replay.
As for the survival horror label given by online reviewers, we'll get into that in a sec, but let's just say this might be one of the very few times where an opinion in games media was actually close to the mark. Song of Horror starts out with you taking control of some guy named Daniel. Our boy Dan just got off of work and is looking to watch some late 90s TV. But as luck would have it, he gets a call from his boss asking him to look in on a writer whose manuscript is due soon. Apparently no one can get in touch with the guy, and he's a prolific writer, so they want to make sure he hasn't disappeared. Daniel's not exactly thrilled at the notion of driving out to the middle of nowhere on a Friday night, but he's a recovering alkie and is looking to climb the corporate ladder, so he begrudgingly agrees. Once Daniel gets to the house, he finds the door open and some music box belting out tunes from somewhere in the place. After a quick search, he's unable to find a living soul, but does come across a door that looks like it shouldn't be there. As soon as he walks inside of it, the door immediately closes, which is a trope in and of itself, and that would be bad enough, but the door itself actually disappears as well, leaving behind a sort of dark stain where it used to be. Daniel stumbles around in the dark and recounts that he's been there for days, just hallucinating in the nothingness, and he's terrified at the idea that maybe the things he's seen and heard down there aren't exactly products of his imagination. Flash forward to Monday, and his boss is understandably worried, so Dan's ex-wife, who left him back when he was a drunk, decides to see what the hell's going on over there, and this is when things get very interesting. Song of Horror isn't exactly your average survival horror game. It takes an almost roguelike approach to how it's laid out. You can pick from a pretty wide selection of characters to play the game as, each one having different stats, and after playing a bit as Dan's wife, I started to think those stats were just set dressing, but it didn't take very long for me to find out exactly how important they really are. Now, when the game first started off, I sort of figured that each character might have different chapters and maybe each one would help put the full story together, but that little theory turned out to be way off. In this game, you don't exactly have a restart from your last save sort of option on death. If a character dies, you've got to choose another one and pick up where you left off. Now, when I said roguelike, I assume you immediately thought about randomly generated game content, and that is a slight factor here, but not in the way you might think. The house you're exploring remains the same no matter who you're playing as, but the scares and unique events that take place are a combination of being character-specific and randomized. On my first playthrough, I lost Sophie to a random room I barged into a little too fast, and I figured since I'd grown fond of her, I'd just restart and play as her again instead of picking a new character. Well, on that new run, I noticed events that never occurred before, and that made things way more unnerving. Usually, permadeath is a tough sell outside of strategy RPGs, and even then you really gotta approach it right, but I really enjoyed how much stress this added to the game. In any survival horror game, a death might at worst mean a loss of progress. If it's been an hour since your last save, the last thing you want to do is have to retrace those steps thanks to a stray zombie bite, but in Song of Horror, the longer you play, the more you get attached to your character. These guys talk a lot during the game, developing a bit of a personality. They make quips about the situation to themselves, and their dialogue is different when examining elements in the environment. Some of them a little more on the nose than others. I thought that was a great touch. It really added a bit of finality to death that had me dreading it even more than I normally do in these kind of games, and I guess since we've covered the fact that you can die, we should probably talk about how to avoid that. And in my opinion, this is where we start to stray a bit from survival horror. Song of Horror doesn't seem to have any combat in it, or at least none that I've found playing up to about the halfway point. Instead, you can only really run or hide from threats in the game, and if you know me, you know I always say that the genre needs to have combat as an option. Of course, part of playing these games well is deciding when, where, or if at all you want to engage with it, but it's gotta be there. So maybe we take a few points off there, but trust me, Song of Horror gets them back real quick in how true it stays to every other pillar of the genre. On top of that, the permadeath mechanic adds so much tension to actually succumbing to the Lovecraftian horror in this house that I really couldn't imagine it working any other way. As you explore the old place, you'll come across adventure game style puzzles that'll need you to apply the right MacGuffin to fix or look around and observe some element of the environment to decipher the odd combination lock. It feels very authentic to that familiar Resident Evil design, but also stays intuitive, so when you come across a problem and then its solution half an hour later, it's really easy to remember, oh yeah, these tongs might help me get whatever's at the bottom of this clogged ass toilet. On that note though, maybe don't go reaching into every bathroom item you come across. Trust me on that one.
Freezing. Thank God. I think it's over now.
Song of Horror was a big surprise for me. At its start, it's deceptively simple. It plays like your average survival horror game, but the longer it goes on, the more deep and complex its systems become. It puts a very welcome spin on a style I'm already in love with and makes for one hell of a unique gameplay experience. It does, however, suffer from a few problems you should probably be aware of. And we're going to break with tradition here and start with its absolute worst issue, the fact that the game has an incredibly slow start. The first few minutes of the game are spent looking around Daniel's apartment for no reason, and after that, unless you know exactly where to go, you can spend a lot of time at the Husher house trying to figure out where it's leading you. And even after you pick up the game proper, there's a slow build before you catch wind of anything with malintent being in the house with you. Now, on one end, yes, this does absolutely build tension, but I imagine there are a few people who didn't make it to the parts of the game that are so damn enjoyable. So coming into this one, expect it to have a bit of a slow burn, but I promise you it's worth waiting out. And I guess this next one is sort of a compliment wrapped in a complaint. It is really easy to die in this game. My first death came from just running into the wrong room. See, early on it introduced a mechanic where you can put your ear to the door before walking in a room and make sure the coast is clear, and that's really cool, especially in a game with no offensive options. But the problem is, I spent a full hour listening to doors before walking into them and never came across one that had anything in it, so I sort of stopped after a while and never had any issues, so imagine my surprise when I do exactly what I've been doing this whole time and accidentally walk in on this terrifying sight. Like I said, this is a bit of a compliment because that first death was traumatizing enough to ensure I was listening to every damn door I came across, but past that, some of the quick time event adjacent moments where you need to stay calm or keep an evil presence out of a room can be pretty easy to fail. My second death came when I was trying to keep a door closed and thought I was doing everything right but ended up dying anyways, which I guess is where the strength stat would have come in handy. So I guess the point here is that this is a really challenging game, but again, this does help add to the tension and scare factor, so I guess take that one with a grain of salt. And last up is the game's visuals. Much like its slow burn start, Song of Horror does not begin with its best foot forward presentation-wise. This thing really excels at rendering a beautifully scary environment shrouded in inky darkness, but it's not so great when the lights are on. And sadly, the entire beginning of the game is spent looking at assets that are a little underwhelming in full daylight. Like I said, the game's at its absolute best when you can barely see, and that's not a dig at it or anything. When the lights go out, it is an absolute sight to behold, but when things are well lit and up close, you can see some animations and 3D model work that looks significantly less impressive. Once it gets dark enough to get your flashlight out though, expect to be wowed by how great everything looks. And despite all those small gripes, this was an incredibly enjoyable time. I went in not knowing what to expect, and just when I figured I had something generic on my hands, the game went and pulled the rug out from under me in the most satisfying way possible. The antagonist, for lack of a better word, being some ethereal haunting type of deal, really makes this game stand out in the genre and sort of helps explain why I can't just pick up the rifles and swords scattered around this house and go to town on it. The fact that this isn't some bloodthirsty zombie or crazed psycho killer, but instead a dark force from beyond the realm of human comprehension makes for an insanely effective horror atmosphere. I've got no issues admitting I jumped at no less than 3 parts of the short time I spent with this game. Now, full disclosure, I haven't beaten the game yet, so for all I know it might go to shit past the halfway point or something I've already said might be proven wrong, but I don't really think that's something you should worry about. Song of Horror is just flat out awesome, and I would totally recommend it to anyone looking to get that typical RE experience, but with a few twists as significant as they are enjoyable. If you want the real effect though, make sure to play it in the dark, have some good headphones on, and maybe keep a few pairs of spare pants within arm's reach. Lost in Vivo has been a darling of the indie horror scene since its release in 2018, and as a guy who spends way too much damn time on YouTube, I've seen plenty of my favorite content creators cover it. But based on those passing glances, I sort of wrote the game off. I saw the perspective and heard people compare it to Silent Hill, which in my book is almost always a recipe for disappointment, so I sort of let this one pass me by. Well, fast forward 4 years and an older, way fatter version of me is working on a video covering games just like this, and I finally decided to see what all the fuss was about. The game starts off with a therapist of some kind talking to their client, recommending they undergo in vivo exposure therapy, a method that'll have people being introduced to the things they have unhealthy fears of, and I guess that makes perfect sense because this game sort of aims to provide that same service. Apparently, this thing's supposed to have a quasi-claustrophobic effect on the player, to the point where the developer allows you to change the very narrow FOV, but recommends that you don't since it might ruin the intended effects. So I decided to go against my better judgment and leave it at stock and start the game up. At the beginning, our main character, who to my knowledge is never actually named, is walking their cute dog when a sudden storm hits and somehow his little cutie gets caught up in a storm drain. So our protagonist, being of the Adam Sandler school of missing pets, jumps into the unknown to
find that fucking dog!
As soon as we get down there, we can whistle to find our pooch, and at one point we finally come face to snout with the little guy, but he's dragged away deeper into the abyss, and I'll be damned if I'm gonna let a single knife-wielding hobo keep me off the trail of a good boy. So away we go. As the game progresses, the environment becomes more twisted and warped. At the start, we're dealing with what I would call a pretty standard sewer system, but we end up making our way through an old 1920s looking subway tunnel, complete with flesh-eating subway trains because why the hell not? Then we come across some kind of weird research lab that takes animal testing a bit too far, and an endless dungeon type of area that gives zero shits about the laws of physics. Really though, I can't say much else about the story because there isn't much of it around to talk about, and I think that's by design. The developer really only gives you enough to get your ass in gear looking for that dog, and to be honest, anything past that is just a bonus in my opinion. Now, I'm sure there are wikis out there that will have combed through every single journal entry you come across and pieced them all together using clues found in the game's code or something, but for a first-time player, there is effectively no story. It seems to me the entire game might just be a sick person rationalizing what they're going through with their in vivo therapy, or maybe just some kind of interactive allegory for that procedure, but either way, I'd say come into this one expecting to do a bit of legwork on the story side of things, and you might be pleasantly surprised. On the gameplay front, I will admit I had this game all wrong. Like I said before, I had already formed my own dumb bias against the thing and had just assumed I wouldn't like it. Now, I did watch a few reviews over the years, but I either just glanced up at them while doing something else or blocked out parts of those videos because I got the impression this was a really linear game. I don't know, maybe it's the visuals of the sewer tunnels that did it to me, but for one reason or another, I just assumed this couldn't fall into the realm of RE clone from a sheer gameplay perspective, but since it's on this video, I'm sure you've worked out I was wrong. Lost in Vivo contains most of the traits you'd want out of a survival horror game. You explore large, twisting environments, trying to find items that'll help unlock more areas to progress forward, engaging in tough combat that has you wagering limited resources on the decision to run or fight. There's a lot of backtracking through the game world, which leads you to becoming really familiar with your surroundings, and puzzles that'll require you to think a little outside the box. I was sort of taken back when I had to run consecutive miles in the first real gameplay area to shut down a few breaker boxes so that I could reset an electrical system and hitch a ride out of there. I guess I just wasn't expecting gameplay that actually stayed true to the genre, and because it was such a surprise, I think I enjoyed in Vivo all the more. Which is really cool because at first the game doesn't do much to curb that initial assumption. It starts in a very linear fashion with you just navigating winding sewer tunnels looking for the one and only way forward, but then everything widens out after you hit the subway station, and while there is some variation, it mostly sticks to that model. It seems like each area has its own theme to it, but I really liked all of them. One of my favorites being the above mentioned section where I had to turn off power in like 3 or 4 spots of this big ass station. In doing so, I would be blacking out entire sections of the station, and in the dark, these floating ghost things would spawn. These things seem to be infinite, but my resources definitely are not, so in moving the game forward, I was sort of forced to turn the lights out and leave myself susceptible to the dangers therein, which as I'm writing this, I'm realizing really keeps with the whole in vivo experimentation thing. In a different but similar situation, in the latter half of the game, I came across a very different kind of puzzle. I was trapped in an endless hallway, but the puzzle wasn't finding the right route to progress, because you can move forward no matter which side you take, but one of them is going to pit you against a giant fetus thing that might be impossible to kill. Either that or I just suck at the game. Oh, and just a tip so you don't end up having to alt-tab into a guide after spending 10 or 15 minutes in this room, maybe don't make any assumptions about these bars here, specifically in regards to their, let's say, corporeality. What I really appreciated about the game, though, was not its gameplay, fun as it was, but instead the fact that it was constantly messing with me. Lost in Vivo definitely skews more towards the psychological horror side of the survival horror spectrum, and obviously takes a lot of hints from Silent Hill. Well, just like SH, Vivo likes to make sure you stay very uncomfortable. At one point, I was on my last lockpick and it seemingly randomly broke while trying to pick the only lock in between me and the next area. So in frustration, I hit the door with a sledgehammer and turned around to maybe find some more lockpicks. But I didn't make it more than a few steps before I heard the odd sound of the thing just creaking open on its own. Similarly, I would die to a powerful enemy and reload a save to find the enemy just not there anymore, but instead the previously safe areas were now filled with these weird mirror guys that took a good chunk of damage to take down. There was even a section where I went to examine a corpse, but the game put him in my inventory and threw me a Unity engine error message, which I'm like 75% sure was just the game screwing with me. I felt like it did that off and on throughout the entire experience, and it really helped the creep factor a lot. Every time I would feel like I knew what was up and started to fall into a routine, the game would step in to let me know I was not in control of what happens here. It was. At one point, I unlocked some kind of a different game, which was fun and kind of cool, but imagine my surprise when I went to boot up Lost in Vivo but was met with a totally different title screen for a different game, one that you actually have to quit out of before you can play the game you originally meant to play. Keeping with the comparisons to Silent Hill, this game has a soundtrack that is most definitely inspired by Akira Yamaoka's work. Hell, not just the soundtrack, but every aspect of the sound design. Moments that needed to be more contemplative had no music whatsoever aside from some ambient environmental sounds, and when there was music, it was very SH adjacent. There's a lot of atonal industrial sounds stacked on top of each other until some kind of a strange discordant melody is achieved. It's incredibly abrasive, but it fits the feel of the game really well. On startup, the game recommends you put on a pair of headphones, and I want to second that recommendation real hard. With a good pair of headphones on, every echoing drip of water and static broadcasting radio is really going to put you into the game's world. And when navigating the sewer tunnels, whistling for your dog, there's defined enough stereo separation you'll actually be able to map the right route just by ear. Once again, I am very glad to have been proven wrong about a game. Lost in Vivo is incredibly fun and feels like a perfect follow-up to the kind of mind-bending experience that Silent Hill often dabbles in. It plays like a traditional survival horror game, but includes mechanics and content that puts it firmly more in the psychological camp. But no matter what arbitrary genre label you put on it, the fact remains that it's just an amazingly fun video game that keeps you feeling scared as hell. And honestly, if you're even slightly interested in the subject matter of this video, that's probably something you're looking for. I've had Heaven Dust sitting in my Steam library so damn long I can't even remember when I originally bought it. I remember the reason I picked it up was based solely on the trailer making it look like some kind of a top-down RE game, and after finally playing it, well, that's precisely what it is. The story concerns a very familiar setup with a pharmaceutical company finding a virus or something in New Guinea. After doing a bit of research there, it's discovered this stuff called Heaven Dust is able to stimulate cell regeneration, but with the tricky side effect of killing the subject and bringing them back as a bloodthirsty zombie. So eventually the obvious takes place and the facility is overrun by the living dead, and the company decides the one thing they messed up on was not having the research take place on their doorstep. So a lab is set up in the US, and wouldn't you just know it, an outbreak occurs and the whole place sees a massive uptick in the zombie population. You play as some guy who works in the research lab, or actually, now that I think about it, I'm not really sure. I can't remember being told exactly who my character is or why they're there, but regardless, our protagonist saw things getting hairy and locked himself in a storage closet till things started to calm down, and that's where we come in. From the very start, the game sets you up to pay attention to your environment and approach issues with a little more tact than your average gunfight. Once we're out of the storage room, we've got a big facility to explore, and you just know that's going to require our good friends backtracking, puzzle solving, and resource management. As for the story, there isn't much that isn't delivered through journal entries, and most of that is just letting us in on individual experiences before and just after the virus leaked. There is a cool plot thread having to do with a researcher dealing with someone on the outside looking to expose this company for their shady tactics and the people they've killed in the name of covering up this stuff's existence, but at the time of writing the script I haven't finished the game, so I'm not exactly sure where that's headed. Regardless though, a deep and enthralling narrative isn't exactly required here. For these kind of games, I typically just want some reason for me being there and a good reason I'd want to leave, and I'd say Heaven Dust does a good enough job at that. On the plus side though, those individual accounts I was talking about earlier do a great job of fleshing out the world we're in. From what I can tell, I'm more than halfway through the game, and there hasn't been any story that wasn't delivered via text or some journal entry, so I guess keep that in mind if you're looking to play this thing. But in my opinion, this is far from a negative. And that's because this game puts some really fun twist on the kind of experience you're expecting from an RE clone. As you can see, the view is top down, and like I've said maybe 3 times in this video already, this perspective lends itself to survival horror a lot better than you might think. Combat's handled exactly like it is in any other game in the genre, with the whole hold the shoulder button to ready your weapon and hit the action button to shoot thing, and enemies can do some serious damage, so spacing and crowd control are massively important. And speaking of which, if you find yourself between 2 zombies, you might as well save yourself a few seconds and just quit to the load screen, because you are guaranteed to die in that encounter. There are a lot of healing items scattered around in the form of the eternally familiar green and red herbs, but you can't really push through enemies, and their attacks are so fast and your hit stun lasts so long that you stand next to no chance of getting out of that situation. Exploration is just spot on for what I want out of an RE clone, with this big ass compound slowly opening up after keys are found and puzzles are solved. This research lab / mansion makes for an awesome spot to set the game in, and we know that because it's not our first time seeing it. I always just wanted to make a little more progress before turning the game off, mostly because I'd like to see what new rooms I might come across and how they would link back up with the rest of the place. And speaking of perfect segues, let's circle back to the puzzles, which, man, I really had fun with. Some of them required me to suss out a numerical combination based on things in the environment, and those were a little tougher to crack, but the ones that had me pushing stuff around or interacting with the backdrops were really fun to solve. A lot of the time, item hunting was pretty intuitive, like finding a section of pipe to help douse a raging fire or getting a virus sample to throw off a lockdown system. It's the kind of design that has you sort of subconsciously knowing exactly where and how an item needs to be used to move forward. I think maybe this and the exploration were my favorite parts of Heaven Dust. I just really enjoyed feeling like a galaxy brain for knowing exactly where I had to go when I came across a specific MacGuffin, even though I hadn't been to that section of the map in what seemed like an hour. Once again, I had initial issues believing something that looked this cutesy could fit into the confines of a survival horror title, but that's exactly what it does. What's really cool though is that's not all that it does. Sharing a similar system to another game on this list, Heaven Dust has downed enemies dropping a type of currency that can be used at these vending machines to exchange for resources or stat buffs. And this whole thing leads into a very interesting mechanic. See, ammo is limited in the traditional sense, meaning the game has a very finite amount of ammo pickups that you can come across, and that means you're going to have to be smart with how you spend it, but it goes a little deeper than that. In some areas, you'll find spent bullet casings that can be collected, and at these vending machines you can buy gunpowder to get some of your bullets back. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that makes any sense, seeing as how the gunpowder is only half of what you're going to need to make a spent casing an actual projectile again, but it's game logic and maybe we shouldn't think about it too much. Anyways, I just thought this was a neat system. You guys know I like my ammo limited, and this does sort of mess with that, but I think it still fits. See, you've got to spend a pretty rare resource to get gunpowder, and you can't always rely on casings just laying around. If you ask me, it's a pretty well-balanced system that, instead of making me feel overpowered or flush with ammunition, just kept my head a few more inches above water in some of the more hairy sections of the game. Of course, we can't avoid the elephant in the room much longer, which is the presentation. This is essentially chibi Resident Evil, and maybe that's a turnoff for some, but come on, just look at this cute little guy shooting at an even cuter zombie. I love it. I think the art style not only fits the lighter mood of Heaven Dust, but is also pleasing to look at. I mean, sure, you're not going to take any of these monsters seriously, with them looking even less realistic than the PS1's blocky attempt at zombie representation, but they don't exactly expect you to, and besides, it's just cool looking. I really liked how I could see into other rooms while walking through hallways, which meant I was better off navigating here without a map, and that's exactly what I did. Now you can buy a map at the vending machine, but you'll almost always know where you are and where you're going thanks to the non-existent roof over your head. When you or an enemy gets obscured by something in the foreground, you get a nice bright wireframe outline, which is a nice touch and adds a little well-needed flair. Really, my only complaint with the visuals would be the fact that my weapon and inventory are always visible on screen. That kind of takes me out of what little immersion can be had with the visual style. Don't let that fool you though, I have a ton more things to complain about. First up, there are a lot of red flags here letting me know that this project could have used a little more money behind it. There are spelling errors and grammatical mistakes on almost every screen you look at, and when you go outside you can hear a very familiar ambient sound effects track. Now, I'm not really sure if this sound effect is in the public domain or not, but I'm almost positive that the specific combination of it and the track behind it are Capcom's intellectual property, and call me crazy, I don't think they okayed its use in this game. That being said though, it's clear effort went into the things that really matter, so you won't see the typical buggy gameplay or poorly thought out mechanics that tend to accompany low budget or low experience titles. Except for one area that might not be obvious right off the bat. Heaven Dust requires you to make way too many damn trips to the item box. It feels like half the game's runtime is spent trekking back and forth between save rooms to clear up space, and keep in mind you're talking to a guy who defends Resident Evil Zero's inventory system as not being tedious. Imagine how much time is wasted dropping items in a chest for me to get pissed off here. It feels like even just 2 more inventory slots would help balance this little problem and might get your trips to the save room cut down to a more manageable number. That being said though, this is still a really fun game. Even while constantly heading to and from an item box, I was still enjoying the typical survival horror gameplay, especially because of how much of a juxtaposition it is when compared to the game's presentation. What's really cool is Heaven Dust did well enough to get a sequel made, and I'm hoping I can scrounge together enough titles to squeeze a 3rd volume out of this series because I'd really like to try it out. Either way though, I definitely recommend Heaven Dust for people who want that familiar Resident Evil-like experience but want a few little tweaks made so that it feels fresh and interesting. I mean, let's be honest, a bad translation and poor grammar are basically the written equivalent of RE1's, let's say, unique voice acting, right? Some of you guys already know, I covered Alisa a while ago, and I won't keep you in suspense, I absolutely loved it. This is the other half of the 2 games that ignited my passion to check out modern survival horror titles, and with a look like this, could you really blame me? Essentially, it's just an old PS1 game running upscaled on your computer, which almost guarantees a play for me, but it's not just the old polygons that have me pushing Alisa on everyone I know. There's a very good chance that this plays exactly like what you're looking for out of a survival horror game, but it has a few cool twists as well. Just like Heaven's Dust, killing enemies will net you a currency which can be spent at save points to upgrade your gear. As you play, you'll come across ammo and healing items as usual, but your weapons and dresses will only be found through this mechanic. And while, like I said, you can find items in the environment, you can also buy them if you find yourself getting too low. Now, I've been known to go on rants about how a dead enemy leaving behind resources almost always knocks a game out of the running when it comes to classifying it as a survival horror title, and at first this might seem like a backpedal, but I still think Alisa deserves that badge of honor. Mostly because the enemies here don't just drop the ammo or items you need like in modern RE titles. They drop a resource that is incredibly limited. After all, there are only a finite amount of enemies in the game, meaning this currency just fits further into the limited resource aspect of the genre. It's not the game giving you more items when you're low, but instead it's giving you vouchers for items and letting you decide when and where to exchange them. On top of that, the resources that can be gained in this shop are also limited, so you absolutely can screw up a run in this game. Really, I think the system plays really well with the kind of careful balance that comes with survival horror game design, but I'd say it's even more faithful when it comes to exploration. Story-wise, our girl Alisa here is a member of some kind of elite police force working for the royal family, and she's been sent in to look for a thief who has managed to snatch some kind of important plans. In the process of catching the guy, the two get dragged into some kind of weird place called the Dollhouse, and this is one really interesting location to get lost in. Of course, comparisons to the Spencer Mansion are definitely apt here, but this place has a feel all of its own. Since the game sort of plays fast and loose with reality, there are places in this dollhouse that you definitely won't see in your average domicile, which means the developer could go crazy making fantastical backdrops that manage to walk that thin line between believability and interesting design. Most of the enemies you'll encounter here follow a theme of old-timey marionettes, dolls, and toys, which I think is a welcome breath of fresh air in the genre. And speaking of enemies, combat follows the typical rules of these kind of games, but with a few interesting tweaks. First off, you're only able to carry 2 weapons with you at one time, but you can switch back and forth between them with just the press of a button. And to add to the strategy of survival horror combat, you're unable to reload your guns in your inventory, so everything you do while in combat is going to have to take place in real time. I think these two mechanics play really well off of each other. For example, the shotgun takes forever to reload, so maybe instead of attempting to get some space for that long wait, you switch to your sidearm and see if you can finish the fight that way. There's also a nice little mechanic that has you being able to buy new dresses for Alisa, and on top of giving you something nice to look at while you run around and solve puzzles, these threads will also buff certain stats like defense or reload speed. The music in this game sort of sounds like something you'd hear out of an early 90s PC game with lots of MIDI synth. There's also a lot of music box sounding cues, which fits the surroundings really well. It's not the best soundtrack I've ever heard in a survival horror game, but it keeps the mood feeling right, which is nice. Like I said before, I already covered Alisa in full here on the channel, so instead of repeating all that, I'll just link to it in the description and in the little card that, if I did my job correctly, should be showing up in the right-hand corner of the screen right about now. The TLDR version of it, though, is basically this. Alisa is a really fun RE clone that not only looks the part, but plays it as well. If you're watching this video trying to get ideas for new games in the genre to try out, this one should be near the top of the list. It plays like an old game from the 90s, and as you know here on this channel, that's one of the best compliments I can give. And capping off what should rightly be called the sprite-based RE clone video, we've got Lamentum, one of the many titles you guys let me know about in the last volume of this little experiment. Now personally, I wasn't too thrilled to start this bad boy up because its presentation gives me a real RPG Maker non-combat horror kind of vibe, but it did not take very long for me to realize that is definitely not correct. And I'll tell you right now, this is one hell of a survival horror title, but before we get into why that is, let's talk about the story. Lamentum starts out with a nice happy memory, which should immediately raise a few red flags that things are about to get real depressing, and, well, they do. Victor here is head over heels for his wife, but not long into their marriage, she's stricken with some unknown illness. This being the mid-19th century, there isn't much in the way of medical care that doesn't involve leeches or cutting limbs off, so there doesn't seem to be much that could be done here. In his desperation, Victor contacts a man that he's heard of who possesses lost knowledge and has reportedly worked miracles in the past. This mysterious genius responds to the letter, and the couple head on their way to the guy's estate. But they're not in the place for more than a few minutes when things start immediately getting weird. Victor's wife starts acting strange and runs off. While in pursuit, Victor stumbles across, well, himself, but injured and bleeding, the sight causing him to collapse, and when he regains consciousness, it seems like a whole lot of time has passed, and the manor now looks like a hellish version of itself. There's a letter on the nightstand from the person who bandaged his wounds, warning him to stay in his room, but our boy Victor isn't about to let a little blood loss keep him from finding his girl. As we explore the mansion, we come across others unlucky enough to be caught up in this hell on earth, and from the stories they tell, we were here a lot longer than the few minutes we remember. It seems like the guy who runs this show had some sort of a cult set up here, and each one of the people in the house had some kind of serious issue they were looking to solve, just like Victor. Admittedly, I haven't gotten more than halfway through this one, so I'm not really sure how everything fits together in the end, but I really like what I've seen so far. This may not be the first time these elements have ever come together in a story before, but I really like Lamentum's tale. I think the combination of the period it's set in and the Silent Hill-like otherworld everyone seems to be stuck in makes for an awesome atmosphere. And the gameplay is just as interesting. The expected exploration, item hunting, and puzzle solving are all here, and if you're a fan of the genre, expect to hit the ground running with this one. It's a very familiar setup and everything fits together perfectly like you'd want. The manor being a demonic, derelict version of itself makes for an awesome incentive to see more of it, and at points our guy Victor will be transported to an even scarier, organic looking place where some mysterious figure tries to communicate with him. And I mention that because I think the mystery of it all does a lot of the heavy lifting here. While I do love survival horror gameplay, I think having a narrative that helps enforce and incentivize that gameplay really completes the experience. I flat out just wanted to know more about what happened here, and I wanted to see more of the environment, which had me stoked to move forward. Plus, it helps that I'm already a huge fan of backtracking across a big-ass environment filled with more locked doors than on-screen pixels. Being a 2D sprite-based game that operates more on the X-axis than the Y, combat takes a pretty interesting turn here. Like any of the other games we've covered so far, a shoulder button will ready your weapon and another one will attack, and there's also a nifty dodge roll that'll help you stay alive. Balancing that is a stamina meter that'll have you stopping dead in your tracks to catch your breath if you deplete it, so you're going to want to be real careful about how much you run when enemies are around because you're going to want to conserve that stamina for dodging. Honestly though, once you wrap your head around how combat actually works, it's not too hard to get in an attack or two, run away and charge another while the enemy comes at you. I found hitboxes a little hard to get the hang of though, and it seemed like shooting at enemies had a 50-50 chance of missing because they were always just a hair below or above the plane I was occupying, an issue fans of beat-em-ups will know all too well. That aside though, I found combat to be really fun, especially when I got my hands on a slower but more powerful weapon. The inventory here is limited, just like I like them, and I'm happy to say it does not suffer from that heaven dust problem of needing to constantly make trips to the item chest. From what I can tell, there are less necessary collectible items to be found all over the place that seem to affect what ending you get, and that's pretty cool, I guess. After capturing my footage, I checked out a few reviews for the game and found out that some scenes require certain conditions to be met for you to see them, making for a cool bit of replay value. Personally, I was really interested in the other inhabitants of the house and what brought them there, so being able to hear more from them was a good motivator. One thing I really have to praise though are the game's puzzles. They feel like a good combination of that Silent Hill style, that being finding clues and notes and journal entries that can be used to solve some cipher, and your more common adventure game method, which will have you scouting out items in the environment and using them at the right roadblock. There also seems to be a bit of decision making going on because early on I found a rope that I could give to some guy that I had met previously, but I found out I could also keep it for myself for a future issue. There's really a lot going on here, it's pretty impressive. Lamentum may be the last game I played for this video, but I think it's also the one I most want to spend time with once the video is finished. It feels like I'm just scratching the tip of the iceberg as far as gameplay goes, and the mystery and setting have me real damn interested in unraveling all of this. I also gotta admit I'm a bit of a sucker for its presentation. Now we've covered other pixel-based games in the video so far, but this one takes a comparatively lower res approach to the style, and at first I thought it wouldn't work so well in conveying the horror that the game's trying to bring across, but it most definitely gets that job done. The entire game just looks amazing, but I think it's at its best when showing the decrepit and demolished state of the manor. I don't know, there's just something about pixel art horror games that works for me. Maybe it's because I have to use my imagination to fill in a lot of blanks left behind by the low resolution, but either way, consider me a fan. The game's soundtrack is more than appropriate, making sure you feel creeped out at all times, which is exactly what a good survival horror game soundtrack should be doing. Oh, and big props to the sound effects too. Instead of using a chiptune sort of sound which you would expect with how the game looks, they went with really high fidelity, detailed sound work, and while there is a bit of a disconnect between it and the visuals, it comes across really effectively. Honestly, this whole game is just really impressive. I didn't know anything about Lamentum going into this except for the fact that a lot of you guys liked it, and now that I've had some time with it, I can safely say I know why. It has a really interesting atmosphere, and it hits me in the same kind of way that Lovecraft's writing does. There's just something about media set far into the past that lets me suspend my disbelief a little easier as far as horror is concerned. I think maybe it's because we knew so little about the world back then, it's just easier to put yourself into a mindset that anything could happen. A modern city besieged by demons? Sure, that's fun, but not as effective as a small 19th century mansion in the middle of nowhere overrun with unnatural horrors from beyond the realm of human comprehension. It may also help that for the last 2.5 decades of my life, I've been listening to death metal and black metal, so basically anything concerning summoning demons and gore-covered interior design is always going to get my attention. Regardless of what kind of music you listen to, though, Lamentum is well worth checking out. On its face, you may think it'd be hard for it to creep you out, but trust me when I say it is more than capable of doing just that. If you ever found yourself watching Bram Stoker's Dracula and thinking, well, I wonder what this would be like if it was a survival horror game, well, now you've got your answer. Damn, I was kind of joking about that, but can you imagine how good that would be? Fuck, indie devs, get on that. Okay, so starting off, this one's going to be a bit rough to talk about. On one end, Cryospace is a guaranteed win in my book. It's a creepy horror story that takes place in the vacuum of space and follows what I would call a rough copy of Resident Evil's blueprints. And before you come in with the obviously this is inspired by Dead Space stuff, keep in mind Dead Space itself was also inspired by RE. When I first heard about this game, thanks to a lot of you guys in my comment section of the last video, I thought the name sounded a bit familiar, so I looked it up and found a trailer released all the way back in 2020. Comparing it with the most recent trailer on its Steam page, it seems clear the game went through a whole mess of changes, but honestly I'd say that's for the better. I really like the aesthetic they landed on here, and the atmosphere is just right. Okay, so then, what's with all the negativity at the start? Well, I hate to say it, but there's more wrong with this thing than right. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the demo available on the Steam page is an absolute mess. First up, the game says it allows for controller support, but I wouldn't use one if I were you. Not only are you unable to change the resolution past 640 by 480 with a PS4 controller, but you can only move your character around and not your aiming reticle, effectively making the demo unplayable. Past that, animations are jittery as all hell. Little things like crouching and standing back up again has your character's hands moving in and out like some kind of a weak melee attack, and since we're on that subject, your close quarters strikes lack any sound effects, which sucks all the air out of the combat real quick. I mean, I'm just now realizing that would make a very good space joke, so do something with that. On top of that, there is a constant shimmer going on underneath your feet, and past a certain point, my flashlight just stopped showing up. Now, in the game's defense, for one short hallway sequence, it did come back again, but then a dialogue box caused it to go away, so I figured I might restart the demo to see if I could undo whatever caused it to mess up, but the game autosaves progress and gives you no option to load a previous save or start a new game, so I was just stuck with no lights for this run. When interacting with keypads, your mouse movements will still move your character around, and if you're not careful, you can click outside the boundaries of that keypad and fire off a round, wasting precious ammo. And since we're on the subject, sort of, moving around feels very awkward and hard to control. I mean, like, seriously hard to control. Now, there are two control schemes, which would be nice if one of them worked, but neither are particularly effective. On top of that, the voice acting here is pretty damn rough, and yes, that is sort of par for the course in the genre, but when it's not rough, it's just text-to-speech, and if you ask me, I don't know, that seems really cheap. I know this is a demo and they don't have everything together yet, but maybe just don't have any voice acting at all, and continuing that thought, the writing is, well, let's say not up to snuff.
Hello? Hello? I've woken up already. Why is it so dark in here?
At one point, there was a conversation in an audio log where a crew chief addresses an officer and identifies himself as Chief. Like just Chief, as if it was his first name, which got me thinking, is this guy's name and title together Chief, which is hilarious.
Alan, this is Chief. It is irrelevant right now. We have much bigger issues on our plate.
Okay, so admittedly I've been a bit mean so far, but I'm unloading all of this up front because I really think this thing has potential. The setting and atmosphere won me over right from the start, and for some reason I really can't say, I kind of like the overhead twin-stick shooter sort of perspective for this kind of game. When Cryospace does manage to run well, and the graphics or sound or controls aren't bugging out completely, there's some really awesome stuff on display, and I'm already into the mystery they're setting up.
Shut up.
Despite all the jank and issues, there are definitely things in this game that are worthy of praise, and I think at the top of that list is the physics. Since we're in some kind of a derelict craft, just cruising through the darkness of space, there's no real gravity to speak of, so debris and bodies are just kind of floating through the air, and all that stuff interacts with you in a pretty realistic manner. It's honestly a really cool sight killing an enemy, watching the ragdoll physics kick in and their body just sort of succumb to the zero-G. It's interesting, and I didn't know I wanted this in the game so bad till I saw it here. Like I said, there is a lot of good here, but it seems like the game's technical shortcomings overshadow all of that by a not insignificant degree. According to the Steam page, Cryospace is planned to hit the scene sometime in 2023, and here's hoping that's on the latter end of that projection because this thing could use all the time in the oven it can get. I'm honestly pulling for this team though. They've got something here that could very well be a badass time if they can manage to get a handle on the bugs, which at this point outnumber actual in-game mechanics. From what I can tell, they've been getting a good amount of feedback, and most of what I listed here has been brought up to them, so if we're lucky, these guys will listen to those complaints. Cryospace may be just shy of a train wreck in its current form, but all hope is not lost. I'm pretty sure these are bugs that can be squashed, and we've seen people do some amazing things with Unity, so there's nothing preventing this from being an absolute banger outside of the team's skill at development. If anyone working on this game just so happens to be watching this section, please don't take these negatives as insults, but instead constructive criticism. I think Cryospace has real potential, and I would love to see it realized, and here's hoping that's exactly what happens. I'm rooting for you guys. And pivoting from a game that could be great, I figure it's time to talk about one that flat out is great. Fobia is a brand new survival horror title made by Brazil's own Pulsatrix Studios, and for a dev house that to my knowledge only has this one game under its belt, it's pretty damn impressive. I learned about Fobia and its hard to pronounce subtitle from comments in my previous RE Clone videos and a few tweets, so big thanks to anyone who shouted this out to me. I will admit, however, like most of my experiences with new indie-developed horror games, I came into this one with a lot of skepticism. I didn't really expect it to suck me in, so I played it safe at first and just grabbed the free demo off of Steam, and I'm serious when I say that by the time I saw the credits roll on that demo, I was already halfway through purchasing the game. Fobia starts out with a prologue that, well, I'm gonna be honest with you, does literally nothing for the story. It doesn't establish who you are, who the enemy is, or why you're locked up. Realistically, you'll learn much more just from starting the game proper. That being said, though, we do get to see our main character get his torso pierced, so that's fun. The game actually starts with an intro that establishes the fact that we are a reporter and we're checking into a hotel to follow up on a lead. Once we've got our room, we're greeted with a bit of a montage showing a week going by and our character comments on how he's no closer to solving whatever mystery he's after. In an attempt to end the day right, he goes to take a shower but is instead greeted by some kind of a rip in time space. We wake up some indeterminate amount of time later and the place is trashed. We have no idea what's happened in the interim, but we do know we're locked in this room and it's gonna take a little puzzle solving for us to get out.
Shit. It's stuck.
In the process of doing that, we get access to his laptop and we see that our boy was enticed to come here thanks to a forum post describing strange disappearances and odd sightings. He got in touch with the OP and set up a bit of an investigation, however when he showed up, he lost contact with the woman he was supposed to meet up with. Making this the very first time in recorded history someone's made plans with a woman on the internet and they fell through in real life. As the game continues, we find out that this all has something to do with a secretive cult and some kind of a strange power source. There are a few sections in the game where we take control over some guy in the 1920s, and I believe it's setting up the origin of how this cult came into owning this thing, but like a lot of the titles covered in these multi-game videos, I haven't had a chance to beat Fobia yet. Something I've been ironically getting a surprising amount of shit for lately, which I guess is going to have to keep on happening because I flat out don't have time to beat 6 or 7 games every week and a half. Getting back on track though, I am really enjoying Fobia's story. So far it's a lot more mystery than actual substance, but it's being delivered to me at just the right rate, and I'm super interested in getting to the bottom of all this. As far as gameplay is concerned, we've got just about everything you'd likely be looking for in a game so clearly inspired by old RE and SH titles. The hotel we're stuck in is in varying levels of desolation, and getting around isn't a simple concept of just taking the stairs and walking out the front door. There are collapsed sections, fires, and roadblocks of all kinds just waiting to impede your progress, and like you'd expect, nearly every damn door in the place is locked via some form of convoluted puzzle. Going through the process of navigating all the hurdles in your way will have you getting real damn intimate with the environment, which is good because this is another one of those games that refuses to give you a traditional map to follow. And like I've talked about before, this used to be something I really didn't enjoy. Even when playing classic RE games I know like the back of my hand, I tend to check the map every once in a while, but man, you'd be surprised how well you start navigating without one. It becomes second nature and you really don't notice the fact that it's gone after a little while. On the plus side, if that sounds like a bad time for you, there are floor maps posted in some areas and they are nice to check every so often, but they can be out of the way depending on where you're headed, so more often than not, you're probably just going to want to commit the place to memory. Your attacks are pretty slow and your enemies are relatively fast when they get in range, so it becomes a game of hitting weak spots that'll cause a stagger, which will let you get some more free hits in. Aiming your weapon, though, is a little strange at first, with a genuine old-school survival horror approach that I actually really enjoyed. What I mean by that is, even when your gun's out, you're still going to have to aim it, so you'll need to hold down one button to shoot and hit another to fire. It might seem strange in a first-person shooter to only be able to fire when aiming down sights, but you get used to it soon enough and it works fine after that. The puzzles in the game are surprisingly abundant. I mean, they're just all over the place and they are really satisfying to solve. Most of the time, the answer will be pretty easy to divine, but every once in a while you'll need to keep a real eye out for clues in the environment, some of which are, well, technically not really there. Okay, I know that sounds a bit crazy. Let me explain. Fobia's story deals with alternate timelines or universes. I really haven't figured that out yet, but either way, our main character has a lens attached to his camera that pierces the veil, as it were. Using your camera's viewfinder will let you see that same place but in a different time, and on top of netting you extra items, this can help you get through some of the aforementioned puzzles. And this isn't purely a surface level thing. You aren't just changing the way your environment looks. At certain points with the use of your camera, you'll be able to progress to a new area via some pathway that just doesn't exist in your time. I thought this was a really cool little gimmick to see, and it's handled remarkably well here. I mean, for one thing, it made sure I was always on my toes while exploring. Sure, maybe I was standing in an empty room right now, but who knows what kind of supplies might be found in some alternate timeline. And the cool thing is, the game would have still been totally amazing without this mechanic, so it's really nice to see the devs striving to innovate, especially when they don't necessarily have to. Fobia does have this persistent stalker character like Nemesis or Mr. X, but he only shows up in scripted areas and he's pretty easy to avoid once you put a few bullets in him. I know you guys have heard me rant about this before, but I have never really liked this kind of a concept in games where exploration and item conservation are of such importance. But if you are going to have it in your game, I think this is exactly how to handle it so that I don't feel cheated out of health or ammo when some unkillable death machine randomly shows up on my doorstep. Graphically, the game is a damn treat. The environments look absolutely stunning and the lighting is very impressive. Now, Fobia does take advantage of ray tracing, and in some select scenarios it does provide a clear advantage over traditional light maps, but most of the time I'd say it's not doing very much, which is reflected by the fact that I'm able to run this game upwards of 120 frames per second while it's enabled. Even with RTX on though, I still notice what looks like screen space reflections to me, which isn't the worst thing in the world to have in your game, but I have sort of grown to hate this grainy, crawling look that these reflections have to them. You can also see a bit of that classic Unreal Engine shininess on enemies and some elements in the environment, but that's something that's always been an issue with Unreal, or at least as long as I can remember, so no points docked there. I did, however, find it very annoying how overpowering the flashlight can be when you're really close to things, which wouldn't be so bad if it didn't also apply to the items you've picked up and are trying to investigate. Sometimes I'd find myself picking up a picture and I'd have to put it down, turn my flashlight off, and re-examine it just so I could see what the hell it was a picture of. Like I said though, the game is an absolute badass in the graphics department, so don't mistake a few very small issues for actual complaints. But if we are going to talk complaints, I'd say the only thing in Fobia that actually came close to getting on my nerves was the movement, or more precisely the perspective combined with the movement. Instead of making you a walking camera like most first-person titles, Fobia actually puts that camera within a rendered-out body, one that moves and animates as if this were a third-person game, and with that comes the strange concept of playing an FPS and moving around, but having to wait for that body to finish its animations before being able to move again. Okay, so I know that's a little hard to understand. I think the best way I can describe it is comparing it to Rockstar's Euphoria engine. Like, if I were to move around rapidly, I'd have to wait for my body to finish moving to the desired location before I could reliably change to the opposite direction. Kinda like my body was a few steps behind my head, maybe. Trust me, this isn't something that's gonna ruin the game, but every time I tried to simultaneously duck, change directions, or move my head, I remembered it was there. But hey, it being an entire-ass game and me only having one gripe with it is pretty unheard of, so other than that, I would say this is one hell of a modern RE clone. The gameplay checks every box I wanted it to, and the presentation and psychological horror atmosphere are expertly done. I really had trouble putting this one down, and if this video ends up being late, well, now you know why. In my opinion, fans of that classic Resident Evil gameplay loop will definitely get into Fobia, and if you find yourself doubting that, there is a free demo, so go and try it, and that should put that fear to bed pretty quick. If I had to rank it against other games that contain small children in gas masks jumping in and out of alternate dimensions/timelines, I'd say it's easily in the top 5. Have you ever gotten the feeling that a project was specifically made with you in mind? Well, that's how I felt about Brutal Japan. This is a low-budget horror title set in a regular-ass Japanese neighborhood and gives off heavy survival horror vibes. Its creator says that they were inspired by the Siren series, and you can definitely see that influence, but without the sight-jacking mechanic, I'd say this fits pretty firmly into the realm of an RE clone. Brutal Japan is an early access game, and I don't think I'm going to step on anyone's toes when I say that's pretty clear right from the start. It is incredibly rough around the edges, and, well, if I'm being honest, I'd venture to say it's kind of bad. And we will definitely work out exactly why that is, but before we do, let's get down to brass tacks. Like I said earlier, Brutal Japan as a concept is just killer. You play as a Japanese guy who lives in a rough part of town so that he can save on rent every month, and one late night after getting off of work, he seems to have lost his keys somewhere, which, in a weird way, is probably the most horrific scenario we've covered in this video series so far. Seriously, you ever lose your keys before? It's like the worst situation imaginable. Well, anyways, so now in the dead of night, this guy has to explore this eerily quiet neighborhood so he can find his keys and get home. In the process of doing just that, he stumbles on some weird homeless guy who attacks him out of nowhere, and now he's got to sneak his way around what seems to be a never-ending army of homeless guys, or maybe it's supposed to be just one dude, I'm not really sure. Which means you'll be doing a lot of running and not so much fighting. And yes, I do have some spicy thoughts on non-combat horror games not being survival horror, but there is a component in this game that'll have you smashing the less fortunate with an umbrella or a broken bottle, so it looks like I once again win on a technicality. Really though, that's all there is to the gameplay. You find some items around the environment, use them to solve some very rudimentary item-based puzzles, and try to dodge a homeless guy, so I guess we could stop burying the lead here. Like I said, I really did not like this game, and most of that is due to what I have to assume are mistakes or errors. Because if they're not, these guys just actively hate the people playing their games. Alright, so allow me to elaborate on that. The first thing you're going to notice is the fact that the keyboard is the only officially supported way to play the game, which isn't terrible. I mean, I played through whole-ass Resident Evil games using a keyboard, and it actually works pretty well. What doesn't work, though, is this game's controls, or I guess more importantly, their sensitivity. You can use either ASWD or the arrow keys to move around, but regardless of which you prefer, just looking in the direction of the left or right keys is going to have your character nearly pulling a 360. Seriously, the turning controls are so damn sensitive, I never really got used to them. I had to start just barely tapping left or right, which is really hard to wrap your head around when you don't have to be that careful using the up direction. Oh, and just in case you were wondering, the down arrow literally does nothing. I don't even think it has a function map to it in the game. Moving on from there though, the point of the game is to avoid the wandering homeless guy, and doing that can be a lot harder than it sounds. This asshole moves in a manner that Random doesn't even begin to describe. The guy's constantly changing direction, and I found no real strategy to work in terms of just getting by him unnoticed. If he does catch wind of you, he'll give chase, and typically that lasts until you've gained enough ground for him to give up. The game does give you a sneaking option with a crouch sort of walk, but I still got noticed while crouching, and thanks to the random nature of the enemy's movements, I just ran everywhere. Because if I'm going to play a game that's actively working against me, I'd rather not extend that time by creeping along at a snail's pace. Getting away from your homeless attacker is simple enough, but you can't interact with items while he's chasing you, and you're gonna need to do that to progress, so have fun with that. Oh, and I nearly forgot to mention, the game often just spawns this guy in a few feet in front of you, so even if you are being incredibly careful, you are still going to struggle with getting caught. At one point, the game would just spawn this guy in as soon as I rounded a corner. No matter how I did it, fast, slow, it didn't matter, he would just appear out of nowhere, which is a real problem because this is a very small section of the map and there were things I needed to interact with which can't happen while being chased. So I would just run back to the beginning of the area to catch my breath and try again later, and I went through this process maybe 7-8 times. Later I found out this section contains the one and only object you can actually interact with while being chased, and as you can imagine, that was really fun. Oh, and the best part was that 2 or 3 hits kills you, which forces a restart to just about the beginning of that chapter. And if I had to guess, I would say this section killed me maybe 4 times, which meant I spent a lot of my playthrough just making it back to this part. And to add insult to injury, there's an autosave maybe a minute's worth of progress from this point. I also ran into issues picking stuff up even when I wasn't being chased because the text prompt that tells you can pick something up appears long before you're close enough to actually do what it says. I think this thing is a little too specific with where you can and can't be to interact with stuff, so expect to spend a lot of time finding that one square pixel it wants you to stand on before you can pick up that item. In the game's favor though, this is a really effective atmosphere that comes from, in my opinion, it taking place in a really effective setting. This place looks convincingly like your average Japanese neighborhood, specifically mine in Nakano, and while yes, this might be one of the safest countries to live in on Earth, I've got to admit there is an odd creepiness to walking the streets late at night and experiencing the isolation of seeing no one else around and the eerie quiet that can fall over a place that lies just a minute or two from a major road. So definitely an A+ on the atmosphere, and I think that's helped along by a lot of cool visual options. Obviously, this is a pretty simple looking game, but it includes a 4x3 option, which is always nice, and a VCR screen filter that I actually liked. After starting the game with this filter on, I could not go back to how clean it looks without it. And keeping with the upward momentum, there are a few different endings, which is actually really nice. One time I ended up beating the homeless guy to death, which took a considerable amount of effort, believe you me, and after getting my keys and returning home, my character ended up getting hauled off to jail. The tabloids called me the office-working homeless hunter or something like that, which is absolutely hilarious. And more funny than that is my next playthrough where I hit him just enough to get him to drop the keys and circle back to pick them up. For this one, I get home and decide no monthly savings are worth going through that again, so I end up in a nicer part of town and things are going well for me. Until I get a notice from a lawyer representing that homeless guy saying he's willing to sue me for scarring him while literally defending myself from his attacks. The sad part being this is probably the most plausible and realistic ending you can get. Now, I'm almost positive there's at least one more, but honestly, I'm not trying to play through this game again. In the end though, this is an early access game, so there is hope the developer can iron out these incredibly annoying bugs because this could really be an awesome time based solely on the look and feel of it alone. They seem to be aiming for releasing a few more scenarios, which, to be honest, I really wouldn't be interested in playing unless they see some serious polish. I will keep my eyes on this one because there is some promise here, just not enough to warrant the absolute pain that is playing through it again. If you are interested, it's only going to run you maybe $2 or $3, and perhaps a few more purchases will get their asses in gear on improving things here, but if not, at least I got to play a very interesting walking at night in Japan simulator. One that, according to the developer, is indistinguishable from Japanese reality. Okay guys, we need to have ourselves a bit of a talk. For as long as I can remember, viewers have been recommending I play Lone Survivor, and I can totally understand why. I mean, if there's two things I love in this world, it is good pixel art and survival horror gameplay, and both are most definitely represented in this game, but here's the catch. I just flat out do not like it. And believe me, this is not a recent revelation. On and off for years I've tried to get into Lone Survivor, and each time I restarted I think to myself, maybe I was tired last time, or I just wasn't in the right mood for this type of game, but I am never able to get very far in this thing. Before we get into that though, we should talk about how the game works, and then maybe we'll try and figure out what exactly is wrong with my brain on this one. Lone Survivor is the story of this guy. In the intro, he says his name's not important, so I guess we'll never know who he is, but according to him, there's been some sort of an outbreak, and the only reason he's still alive is because he shut himself in his apartment and rarely, if ever, left. The game starts, and the general goal is to find some more supplies to keep our guy alive for just a little longer, but it's not long until we start seeing some cracks in his story. Our main character seems to be almost constantly hallucinating and even conjures up people to talk to. In fact, the sparse amount of dialogue you get in the game seems to point the direction that these people may even not exist. And without finishing the game or ever looking up its story, I can already call dibs on this being some sort of a Silent Hill 2 thing. You know what I mean, the kind of story where everything is actually an allegory for the protagonist coming to grips with some sort of past trauma or terrible thing that he's done that's torn his psyche apart. I'm calling it right now, you guys let me know in the comments if I'm right or not. Our man sometimes sees this guy with a box on his head both in the real world and in his dreams, and sometimes has Twin Peaks Red Room style visions of himself sitting next to some guy and refusing to talk to him. So on top of the whole Silent Hill 2 prediction thing, I'm gonna go ahead and throw the unreliable narrator trope in there with it as well. Like I said before, I've never beaten this game, and really I'm not interested in ever trying, so there's definitely a lot I'm missing out on, but to be totally honest, the level of cryptic dialogue at the start did not move me in the opposite direction. I'm being dead serious when I say that a lot of the interactions I experienced in this game felt like they could have been written by Neil Breen.
Programmable matter.
We will all be connected telepathically.
Special agencies are prepared.
Gameplay-wise, we've got a few different elements overlapping here. At first, you have no real means to defend yourself, so you'll need to sneak around enemies using hiding spots or chunks of rotten meat to distract them, and this actually works pretty well. After a while, you will get your hands on a gun, and just like you'd expect in a survival horror game, ammo's going to be scarce, meaning you're only going to want to use it when you have to. On the plus side, the game does give you some form of combat avoidance in most situations, but since you'll be traveling back and forth using the same routes over and over again, you might want to plug a few of these creeps just to make your life a little easier. While exploring and finding items that'll unlock more of the apartment complex, you'll also run into the need to eat and sleep, and this is a major stumbling block for me. I mean, sure, eating is easy enough. You'll find foods and snacks in the environment, and you can eat most of them on the spot, but it's the sleeping that bothers me. On top of being crazy as all hell, I'm pretty sure our main character here is suffering from a severe vitamin deficiency because it seems like he can't play for more than 5 consecutive minutes without him complaining about needing to sleep, and this means halting all forward progress to return to your apartment. Now you can sometimes encounter a dream sequence when you do this, which sort of makes the trip feel a little more fruitful, but most of the time you'll just be trekking back there to refill some invisible gauge. Luckily, you can fast travel by looking at mirrors, so it's not as bad as it could be, but this guy's narcolepsy still kicks in just when I'm starting to get into the groove of things, which means I have to stop the part of the game I enjoy to engage with the part that I don't. Continuing with the complaints, I really did not like the way the game map is laid out here. Now, we have covered quite a few 2D survival horror games in the series, and I've really enjoyed all of them, but where they differ from Lone Survivor is in the Y-axis. LS has you solely navigating a single horizontal plane, and that makes the map incredibly hard for my brain to memorize. The perspective changes so randomly from room to room, it's hard for me to keep track of exactly where I am and how I got there. Okay, so that might be a little hard to explain, so let me give you an example. You may enter a door directly behind, or I guess above your character depending on how you look at it, but then you end up in a room where the door you just walked through is on the left-hand side of the screen. There's just no concrete point of reference that lets you know what direction you're actually headed in, and at this point I'm sure you're probably yelling at me to just use my map, but that's the real kicker. Past the first 20 minutes of the game, I just couldn't get this little shit to pull the damn thing out. Every time I'd hit the M key, he'd say he knows this area like the back of his hand, and I guess that's nice, but I don't. Honestly, guys, if I had any hair at all, I would have pulled it all out trying to figure out how to open the damn map up. So I did a little bit of research, and it seems like this is actually a glitch. Apparently for some people, the game just turns their normal difficulty save into expert mode when they quit out of the game and try to reload that save, so that's fun. And I think that perfectly leads me into another issue I have. Apparently this game is essentially just a Flash title, and because of that, there are no traditional controls over how you want to play it. I mean, come on, this thing is just begging to be played with a controller on PC, but when I try to use my PS5 or PS4 controller, hitting start or any other two buttons just exits the damn thing. On that same note, you have absolutely no way to alter the resolution or switch to windowed mode, which wouldn't be as much of a big deal if the game didn't use big chunky pixels. Pixels that at 4K are so large that text becomes incredibly hard to read and small details are almost unseeable. Now, it's not exactly unplayable for me, but depending on how good your eyesight is or how close you are to your monitor, it may be for you. Now, there is what the game calls an aspect ratio hotkey that you can hit at any point, but it just crops the top and bottom of the screen. It doesn't increase the resolution or decrease the amount of stretching that's going on, so it's effectively useless unless you really like forced letterboxing, I guess. Okay, I know I've been complaining a lot, but I really want to put this out there. I do not think Lone Survivor is a bad game. Sure, there are some general game design issues that I think gets in its way, but a lot of people seem to like this thing, and I can 100% see why. It has an awesome atmosphere, great pixel art, and a soundtrack that is flat out to die for. It technically does a lot of the things I enjoy so much in the genre, but I just cannot force myself to have fun with it. I truly don't know what it is about this game, but I get bored playing it about an hour in every single time I start it. This time I did make it to an hour and a half, but I just wasn't enjoying myself, so I'm gonna have to say something very odd here. Lone Survivor is a game I positively do not like, but damn it, I wish I did. I want to know the payoff for the mystery it's setting up, and I love most of what it's doing in theory. The sound effects, exploration, pixel art, atmosphere, and general mood are all guaranteed bangers for me normally, but something's keeping me from getting into this one. So I guess I'll say this. Even though I really don't enjoy Lone Survivor, I'd still recommend you guys give it a shot. It's around 15 bucks on Steam, and for that price point, I'd say most of you stand a good chance of getting some kind of return on your investment. For all I know, there might just be something about the way I'm wired that keeps me from seeing what everyone else sees here, but if that's not the case, let me know in the comments if you're of the same mind. It'd be nice to feel like I'm not crazy. Well, let's say less crazy, maybe. In my last video on RE clones, I found myself smitten with the first Heaven Dust. Sure, it did have a few kinks I thought could have been worked out, but it accurately mimicked that original RE gameplay style, which is exactly what I look for in this series. Well, this week I decided to see if the sequel could deliver on everything that made the first one so good while patching a few of the holes that bothered me, and interestingly it did just that. Heaven Dust 2 takes place right after the first game, with our main character narrowly making it out of the lab, only to be captured by the same company that put him in that life or death situation in the first place. And after spending a little bit of time in what is explained to be some kind of a sleep pod, I guess, this guy wakes up to the same exact scenario as last time. It seems like someone high up in the company is leaving him clues and is looking to collaborate on getting their collective asses out of Dodge before this new compound blows up. This time around, I was pretty damn stoked at the inclusion of an honest-to-goodness story delivered by something other than journal entries. There are other characters you can actually interact with here in Part 2, and their inclusion really helps this feel like a more substantial tale than the last one. This very well may just be a retread of the first game's events, but since Part 1 didn't have much of a story to speak of anyways, I'm pretty confident in saying you might as well just start with this one if you're looking to play Heaven Dust. And I'm happy to say the same goes for its gameplay. Heaven Dust 2 plays exactly like its predecessor, only with a little more polish applied. You'll still be running around a large pharmaceutical lab in the midst of a viral outbreak, and just like before, that process is the real bread and butter of the experience. Of course, you know this song and dance already. You'll slowly unlock more of the compound as you progress, finding key items and solving puzzles, which you should definitely be expecting from any game on this ever-growing list. Other than a very noticeable jump up in general tightness as far as gameplay mechanics go, I was also really happy to see more puzzles here in Part 2. It seems like every major area has more than 10 significant puzzles to solve before you can move on, and I'm happy to say they are just challenging enough to make you feel accomplished when you solve one, while staying away from that dreaded moment in survival horror games when you get stumped and have no idea how to proceed. On the flip side of that coin, I'd say fans of the genre might find these to be a little easy, but in my opinion, they're getting close to just the right kind of difficulty. Solutions are usually found within a few rooms of the puzzle itself, and more often than not, you can find out how to triumph over a head scratcher by looking at your surroundings just a bit closer. There were a few times where I nearly got close to getting stumped, but then I would notice some tiny detail I had just passed by, and suddenly I knew exactly what to do. Honestly, it's sort of strange such a low-budget title would do this well with an aspect of the genre even big AAA developers often trip over. And speaking of compliments, the combat here follows in the same steps of all the other mechanics by being exactly like what you could find in the first game, only polished to a mirror-like sheen. Instead of only relying on random critical hits, you can stay locked onto an enemy for a certain period of time, which will net you a headshot. Of course, you can still get the odd random critical, but now it feels like you have a little more control over combat. If you approach a situation correctly, you should be able to down the opposing zombie before they get within striking distance using carefully timed headshots, but if something does get too close, you can still unload on them with unfocused shots from the hip and earn yourself a little breathing room. Part 2 adds grenades to the mix, which are expectedly handy, and because this is a survival horror game, that means you will always be just on the verge of running out of them. They can also be used as a resource to gain access to items you wouldn't otherwise be able to get your hands on, so that makes them more valuable and interesting. Gone are the stat upgrades and collectible currency from the first game, which you won't see me crying over, but you can find gun parts scattered around which will apply very similar buffs to your weapons. You can still come across spent shells and combine them with gunpowder to get ammo, only this time they aren't seemingly randomly spawned into the environment, so it feels a little more balanced. There's a few different types of malformed monstrosities you can come across this time around, each one requiring different tactics, like using a shotgun to blast away protective bones that have grown over a weak spot, or using electrical grenades or a machine gun to deal with enemies that can rapidly heal. I came across a few boss fights as well, which is always nice to see, and as you might expect, or at least hope for, these were also a bit of a puzzle in terms of getting through them without spending every last round you have. Oh, and this was actually really cool. They fixed the issue I had with constantly having to travel back and forth between item boxes because my inventory was so small. Now, not only do you have more room in your inventory than before, but you can also find upgrades for it. Not to mention the fact that your guns no longer take up space as long as they're equipped. Man, talk about listening to feedback. Really, the only criticism I could think of while writing this script up was the fact that healing items are a little more plentiful here than in the first game, which is crazy because I was always flushed with them back then as well. Graphically, Heaven Dust 2 carries a similar style as the first game, but much more visually impressive. They stuck with the more chibi proportions, which is fine by me, but the general artistry is clearly much better here. The environment has a lot more details in it, and zombies are a little more gruesome this time around, but still pretty cute. On that note, I love it when enemies show bullet holes when you shoot them. I'm not sure why, but I've always really enjoyed this little detail, and you don't see it in games enough, even nowadays. Back in my last video covering Heaven Dust 1, I got a lot of comments bewildered by the fact that I would play the first game first, which I thought was a little weird, but now that I played the sequel, I can definitely see where you guys were coming from. Heaven Dust 2 is amazingly fun and perfectly fits that empty void left behind every time you realize Capcom will never release another survival horror game again. It transplanted everything I enjoyed about the first game over while fixing almost every single complaint I had. As a sequel, it deserves praise for doing what most never do, but as an RE clone, it deserves a spot in your library. This thing's only going to run you $15 on Steam to grab a hold of, and I would say it's a steal at that price. You can finish this game in maybe 3 hours on a first run, and if you ask me, that's about the sweet spot for these type of games. If you've been watching these videos looking for an RE-like experience to add to your backlog, you've likely already looked into this one, but if you're new to the genre, I would say this would make for an awesome point to jump in at. HD2 gives you a great idea of what you can expect from the genre and acts as a nice little bridge between the modern era and the more tried and true design of old survival horror games. And if all of that didn't convince you, you can fight a bone worm in this game, which is incredibly ironic because it's armored on the outside by the one thing it will never have on the inside. Man, there's some kind of allegory for like depression or something in there.
Come on, kid, get your ass up there.
Murder House is another one of those games I've been getting recommended for as long as I can remember, and with its general aesthetic, you'd figure I would have covered it a very long time ago. I mean, come on, Puppet Combo, did the ring affine texture warping? Be honest. Did you guys make this game just for me?
You gotta help me. The Easter Bunny's trying to kill me.
I started out with the prologue chapter, which takes place before the main game and sets up the star serial killer of the show. You play as a kid who somehow was able to sleep after sitting on this monstrosity's lap and accidentally dozed off in a photo booth, locking him in the mall after hours. Oh, and right off the bat, I'd like to say Murder House checks every single box needed to be a piece of 80s media, which are the 3 M's: mullets, malls, and murderers. Nicely done, guys. After exploring the mall a bit, you find your way to a back room that may or may not lead you out of there, but not before you notice that you're not alone. Shortly after entering that back room, you encounter the Easter Ripper, and since you're only armed with one hell of a haircut, there's not much you can do but hide. Following that, there's some very well appreciated survival horror item collecting and puzzle solving, which will lead you to a nice janitor who offers to lock you in his office while he searches for the killer, but that doesn't necessarily work out. And that's where the prologue ends. The game proper starts off with the local news crew making their way out to the Easter Ripper's house years after his capture. Apparently the realtor has made a $50 deal with this sleazy news producer guy, and the team is looking to make some kind of a special report from inside the house of a famous killer. Right from the start, things are less than ideal with the real estate guy not showing up and you not being able to get into the house. But eventually you get control of your character, a lowly intern, and after breaking into the place and doing some preliminary filming, things start to go in the opposite direction you would want. The news van we rode in on is now demolished, and somehow the Easter Ripper is back and up to his old tricks again, those old tricks of course being murder. So the goal is to make it out of the house and avoid having your insides become your outsides. Murder House does a great job mimicking that early PS1 survival horror gameplay that hopefully we all love so much, with a very, very heavy emphasis on puzzle solving and item hunting. The game does technically have combat in it, although mostly you'll be hiding from the Ripper, but here's the weird thing. I never really had to, for some reason. From what I've heard, the murderer is supposed to show up randomly while you're exploring the house and try to kill you, but I kid you not, he never once showed up in my playthrough. Outside of scripted cutscenes and the final encounter, I never saw the guy. I'm not really sure what's going on there or whether or not I'm lucky or unlucky in that sense, but either way, I don't know, I guess that's worth mentioning. The item-based progression is a nice blend of adventure game logic and easy enough to intuit stuff, so you shouldn't get stuck on any roadblock for too long. If you do find yourself scratching your head though, I'd suggest checking random rooms. The game often moves your crewmates around during the story, and most of the time talking to them will trigger the next event. So overall, things are on the more satisfyingly easy side as far as puzzles go. Well, except for this piano puzzle here. I really don't know what it is about survival horror games and piano puzzles, but they are always a massive pain in my ass. Movement is handled with tank controls, just like the good Lord intended, and they work pretty okay. The controls are a tad on the sensitive side, so it's easy to overshoot a turn or get stuck on the environment, but I think the biggest culprit here is the camera. Murder House has a very Silent Hill type of camera, where it follows a sort of preset movement model. There are all these cinematic sweeps and pans, and it really makes for awesome shots, but controlling your character in these almost always changing perspectives can be a little hard. Just like Silent Hill, you can hold a shoulder button which will stop the camera in its tracks and direct it towards your back. And again, just like Silent Hill, this genuinely might mess with those of you who are prone to motion sickness. It's not horrible or anything, and you will get used to the controls, but it's certainly not what I would call ideal. To be honest though, I think it might be a sacrifice worth making, because some of the horror movie-esque camera angles, sweeps, and pans are just amazing looking. On the presentation side of things, like I said before, this is essentially my preferred look. It masterfully hits that low poly benchmark with smart use of 90s era limitations like low draw distance, dithering, and affine texture warping, but that's only half the story. MH over here probably has the best looking video filters out of any game I've covered for this series. Not only is there a CRT effect, but two for both RF and composite video connections. Very nice attention to detail. Personally, if I wasn't recording footage for a platform whose compression really dislikes static, I would have played with the VHS filter on because this thing looks amazing. There's also a black and white mode, and if you don't like the lower render resolution, you can turn off PS1 mode and see gross-ass smooth polygons. Ew. You can also up the frame rate if you want, but really I wouldn't recommend it. The PS1 setting has it feeling exactly like it looks, and I think that completes the overall package. Murder House has a classic look that manages to walk a very thin line between accuracy and artistically pleasing visuals. I really just appreciate the consistency here. Everything from menus to the title screen keeps that old 80s video rental aesthetic, and it really helps pull you into the time period this thing takes place in. On that same note, the music is absolutely killer. It's a great combination of 80s appropriate synth melodies and horror movie screeching noises. I really enjoyed it. Honestly, I'm struggling to think of something I didn't like about the game, and really my only complaints almost cancel themselves out.
You're lucky you have this after the incident with the poodle.
That could have happened to anyone.
For example, it does suck that I didn't get to experience the main bad guy outside of the prologue chapter, but that sort of works out for the best in my opinion. I'm not going to go into exactly why, but I never really got into the whole persistent invincible stalker thing. Similarly, this is a pretty short experience, taking me just shy of 3 hours to complete, but really I think it ends exactly when it should. The puzzles and item hunting are great here, but in reality, this is just a normal house with maybe an above average amount of rooms in it. I don't think they could have squeezed another 15 minutes out of this location without it feeling artificially padded. And besides, for a survival horror game, 2 to 3 hours is pretty close to average. In my opinion, Murder House is perfect. For what it is. It's a great look back at an old genre using a look and style that will be very familiar to the people most likely to have grown up with that genre. It's not an epic story with lots of intricately overlapping mechanics, but instead a tightly focused and masterfully executed look back at what I would call a better time. It mirrors old games in a way that's both fun in terms of nostalgia, but also well put together in terms of a polished modern experience. Normally, Murder House sits at about $12 on Steam, and I truly could not think of a better way to spend your money. Usually when I play these games to get footage, I'll do it off and on, in between homework and taking care of real life stuff, but I sat down with Murder House tonight, and as I write this, it is 4:47 in the morning. I played it all the way through in one sitting because I just couldn't put it down, and immediately I wanted to write this section of the script so that all the memories were fresh in my head. Hopefully that's enough praise to get you interested, but on the off chance that it's not, perhaps this wonderful scene of low poly gore will sweeten the deal a bit for you.
Help me find an exit!
Damn it, the storm up above must be disrupting their communications. Well, whatever. The show must go on.
Endless Blue is something that immediately caught my eye. It is admittedly offering similar survival horror gameplay to every other game on this list, but its presentation really sets it apart, even among other low-poly titles. If the internet's to be believed, it was made during a horror-themed game jam, and I'm hoping we get to see something that approaches an actual final release because it's got me pumped. According to Endless Blue's itch.io page, its developers were targeting the PS2 for its look, but honestly it reminds me more of the Dreamcast or maybe some late 90s PC games. I mean, come on. Relatively smooth and sharp 3D geometry with low-res, unanimated 2D textures wrapped across. It's a dead match for that pre-PS2 era. Either way though, it looks absolutely amazing to my eye. Now I am going to have to hurry this section up a bit because the entire demo can be beaten in a matter of 10 minutes, so I don't exactly have a lot of footage to work with, but from what I can tell, the slim amount of story here has my ears perked. You play as Reyna, some kind of an agent sent in to infiltrate an underwater research base. We're not quite sure what she's trying to accomplish there, but there's not exactly anyone around to stop her regardless. As you probably expect with a game like this, some sort of an accident has caused an outbreak, turning inhabitants into whatever this is.
What the hell?
What I really liked about this demo, outside of its killer soundtrack, are the cool lighting and post-processing effects. Both Reyna and the environment around her are relatively simplistic in terms of design and geometry, but the more realistic looking lighting, instead of creating some kind of a dissonance, just adds to the atmosphere and makes it impressive even in its primitiveness. It also makes use of camera effects like depth of field to a very cool degree, which to those of you who aren't in the know is what's happening here when Reyna blurs as she gets closer to the camera and then comes into sharper focus as she moves towards the obvious focal point off in the distance. Oh, and call me crazy, but I'm pretty sure they're using text-to-speech for the dialogue here, which, if I am being honest, is only just barely worse than old Resident Evil voice acting anyways.
You want me to swim over there and take on God knows how many of those monsters?
I'll try to explain best as I can, but please, you must come quickly.
Alright, listen guys, competition in this video is going to be pretty damn stiff. There are some absolute showcases of talent that I'm going to be including, and Endless Blue, in my opinion, is swinging with the best of them. It may not be very long, but it tells me everything I need to know about what a full version of this game would be like. I'll make sure to have a link for this and everything we talk about moving forward down in a pinned comment, and I can't recommend enough you guys play this thing. It's incredibly impressive and pretty unique in its presentation, plus it's got easily one of the best credit screens I've ever seen before.
Spotkałeś kogoś z nich? Jak wyglądają? Zauważyłeś coś niezwykłego?
Nic tu kurwa nie jest zwykłe. Co mam ci powiedzieć?
I've been following Holstin's progress on Twitter for a long time now, and looking at it, you can probably figure out why. You guys know I'm a sucker for an interesting presentation, and obviously that's exactly what we're dealing with here. The perspective is really damn cool, with it acting like a bit of a hybrid between isometric and slightly angled top-down. You can control the camera by degrees, and to be totally honest with you, I haven't quite figured out whether or not this is all 2D assets changing their orientation with the camera turns, really low-resolution 3D, or I don't know, voxels or something. Either way though, what you're looking at right now is pure beauty as far as I'm concerned. At the moment, we don't exactly have a long demo to judge this upcoming game by, but instead a nice play area to show off what the team is looking to deliver. While there's no combat included here in the playtest build, I have talked to one of the devs, and in the full release you'll definitely see some survival horror style shooting, which is nice. What is playable here though is a small explorable house that seems to have been created specifically for the demo. You show up at the Janoski residence looking for someone, and in Silent Hill fashion, getting info from NPCs will leave you more confused than had you have never talked to them.
Jezus Maria Tomuś! Wystraszyłeś mnie! Słyszałam jakieś hałasy, ale nie wiedziałam, że to ty!
Everyone seems to have lost their damn mind, and the place is covered in a strange alien fungus that has an aversion to light. Something you might be able to take advantage of if this kid right here hadn't have snatched all the fuses from the breaker and smashed most of the light bulbs. So for most of this demo, you'll be figuring out how to efficiently move around the house while manipulating the scant amount of light sources you have available to you. For example, if there's an area shaded by some furniture or a bookshelf or something, you need to find out how to shine some light over there, and like any good survival horror game, that means hunting for items, solving puzzles, and unlocking shortcuts through the environment. Controls here work sort of like they would in a top-down game, which ensures they stay the same even when the camera's orientation changes. I played this demo with an Xbox Series X controller, and everything felt like it was made to be experienced that way. The only thing I slightly struggled with was the camera rotation not being reversed, but there's an option for that, which makes it feel so much better. It seems like the inventory is technically limited, although you won't be able to fill it up here in this demo. I'm not sure if they plan on taking advantage of that in the traditional survival horror sense with the full release, but let's all hope that's the case. Every room you walk into here in the Janowski house is beautifully populated with detail. Little things like toys, glasses, or picture frames have physics, so you can knock stuff over when you run by, and this mixed with a low volume background music makes for a very immersive kind of environment. It might take you maybe half an hour to get through this playtest build, and while I would love to play more of it, what is here gives you a solid idea of how the core of the game is going to work, and that has me very excited. So far, it's using item hunting, backtracking, puzzle solving, and good old survival horror intuition really well. It's a tiny slice of gameplay for sure, but it is more than enough to get my mouth watering for what's to come. In my mind, Holstin is shaping up to be a killer entry in this new modern survival horror trend. You guys know I tend to prefer the classic style of the genre, with its presentation and gameplay following closely to that of the Resident Evil games that created it, but you can't deny how awesome this game looks, and once you play it, how great it feels. Trust me, you guys are going to want to keep your eyes on this one. As I write this script, the playtest build is public, so you can head to Steam right now and try it out for yourself, and that's precisely what I recommend you do. This is an incredibly unique take on survival horror, and the last thing I want is for the creativity and obvious good taste these guys have leading to anything other than the abject success and recognition they deserve.
Must be pretty boring around these parts.
You would be surprised. Some things happen out here folks wouldn't believe.
Cannibal Abduction is part of what I'm seeing as a new arm of the survival horror genre that aims to recreate that schlocky, creepy feel of low-budget slasher flicks, and I'm totally okay with that. And right off the bat, the game has a few selling points specifically in my mind, and that's a logo design that comes dangerously close to that of Cannibal Corpse and a main character that's rocking a DRI shirt. I'd say so far so good. The game starts out with our main character Henry, who has borrowed his dad's car and is driving through farm country when the thing just up and stops on him. Soon after, a seemingly nice guy with a beard happens upon him and offers to fix his car in exchange for Henry agreeing to fix an old cabinet at his house that his wife has been nagging him about. Which is an odd trade, since I would imagine most mechanics wouldn't exactly see simple carpentry as being too outside of their comfort zone, but hey, this guy's only got one arm. Let's do the horror movie thing and give him the benefit of the doubt. And that's exactly what our main character does. After spending a little bit of time on the piece of furniture, and not fixing it at all, might I add, we use the sun beginning to go down as a sign to wrap things up, which is when we find out the old man has locked us in. Alright, so things are starting to get nice and creepy. After jimmying the lock with a bobby pin, we find a note supposedly left for someone else by the old guy saying that Henry was locked in the room and not to play with the food. Okay, so we have been abducted, and there does seem to be a bit of cannibalism going on here. I'd say that's 100% accuracy as far as the game's title goes. From here, we're able to explore the place we're stuck in, and it's a pretty classic survival horror style environment. Old creepy house with loads of locked doors, dripping pipes, and secret rooms. It certainly checks all the boxes. The gameplay at this point is split into two main ideas. 1, find items and puzzle pieces in order to make progress, and 2, avoid this nightmare of an enemy. Which means this game does sort of end up on a side of the spectrum I typically don't get into too much, specifically the persistent, unkillable stalker classification. That being said, I am an open-minded enough guy, and even I can admit having this hooded freak show up swinging a cleaver around and having to rush and find a hiding spot can have a reliable heart rate spiking effect. I would say the method by which he spawns does seem to tread that thin line between annoying and unexpectedly random. Sometimes he'll just be chilling in a room and you'll walk in on him, and sometimes he's creepily making his way somewhere and you'll end up crossing his path. I mean, it can get slightly frustrating when I've just grabbed a new key and just before I get to the puzzle where it's needed, this member of Deathclock's entourage shows up, forcing me to lose all that progress and find the nearest hiding spot. Although I will say what saves this from being drastically more bothersome is how perfectly sized the playable environment is. This house really only has a handful of rooms for you to explore, and it seems like you're never too far from a safe spot when you're getting chased. What does hinder that process, though, is the fact that the tank controls can be a little unwieldy. The run speed seems a little too fast for the area you'll be sprinting through, which is unnecessary when you can technically outwalk the bad guy, but the bigger issue is the turn speed, or I guess pivot speed, being a little too fast. I found myself overturning when trying to take corners a lot. It just sort of felt like there was a disparity between how I handled with the up and down directions compared to pivoting left or right, which made for a little bit of awkwardness. It wasn't necessarily awful, but it definitely did bother me. And on that note, something that really got on my nerves was the VHS tape damage effect that overlays on the screen. Honestly, I really get the aesthetic they're going for. I've seen this kind of look work really well in stuff like Murder House, and to be fair, the graininess and chromatic aberrations in Cannibal Abduction do a good job of obscuring the low-res textures in 3D models. I'm sure the game would look far more simple and way less interesting without the old VHS look, but the static has a tendency of obscuring things in the environment. A few different times, this would have me missing hiding spots because I would need to shut off my flashlight so the bad guy wouldn't see it, and the dark screen covered in tape damage made for one hell of a time looking for a blob of square darkness in roughly the shape of a wardrobe. That being said, I really liked Cannibal Abduction for what it is. It's an incredibly short game that tells a honestly complete tale, and at a price point of just $5, you really can't ask for much more. There's also a secret ending available that should be relatively simple to trigger for those of you who are harshly familiar with the survival horror tactic of making sure every single interactable object has been checked and every puzzle solved. So as long as you know what you're in for, you're guaranteed a good hour or so of fun out of this one, and I think for some of you that might scratch an itch. It certainly did for me. There really aren't a whole lot of games that accurately recreate that grunge and heart you would find in old crappy slasher movies, so when one comes around that's able to do it in a way that calls back to classic RE-style gameplay, well, I'd say that's worth taking note of. Echoes of the Living is a project I've been interested in for a very long time now, and not too long before starting this video, its developer Moonglint finally put out a demo, and to say it's promising would be the understatement of the century. This little taste test doesn't include any story, so it'll be easy to jump straight into how it plays, but even that's a pretty short discussion. Remember that classic survival horror gameplay seen in Resident Evils 1, 2, 3, and Code Veronica? Well, it's that. Plain and simple, pretty easy to sum up. It's essentially just classic survival horror gameplay. I love it. You know, oftentimes in modern survival horror, there's a tendency to move away from RE and alter the small details of the genre with the intention of freshening up the experience, and that certainly is something I like seeing. Titles like Alisa, Signalis, Holstin, and Conscript definitely do a lot to add a little spice to the recipe that is classic RE-style gameplay, but every once in a while you want that 100% pure dose. Tank controls, item hunting, a city overrun with the Walking Dead, and aiming up to pop heads with shotguns. The real stuff. Well, allow me to introduce you to Echoes of the Living, an indie game looking to accurately recreate that entire experience with an impressive amount of detail. Starting off, we've got a great intro sequence similar to RE2, which will have you running through the after effects of a zombie outbreak till you come across a bar where you can explore for items and possible ways out of this mess. Right off the bat, I noticed that the controls here feel very tight and responsive. And you know, people like to shit on tank controls to no end, but I'll die on the hill that they can be amazingly intuitive and very useful in games with fixed camera angles. But they can be kinda tough to tune well and get them feeling perfect. You know, many of the games I've covered in these videos have gotten very close, but if we're going to use Resident Evil as a benchmark, which, let's be honest, with this channel we always are, ETL has some of the best I've come across. And as a little icing on that cake, the 180 quick turn is activated in the expected method, hitting run and down on the D-pad at the same time. Honestly, every time I start up one of these RE clones, that's the first thing I check for. I mean, it's not the most important thing a game can have, but I don't know, it's always a good sign in my eyes. Anyways, getting back on track, the first section you can actually explore after escaping the bulk of the zombie invasion is this bar, and even though there's probably less than 10 rooms in the entire area, I knew before I'd entered 3 of them that this was going to be a survival horror game through and through. Static camera angles, puzzle solving, item hunting, backtracking, inventory management, it's all here, literally all of it. I mean, name something you liked about the 90s Resident Evil games, and I promise you, it's present here in this demo. So needless to say, it made a very good impression on me very fast. After you get your hands on a gun, you'll find combat works in the traditional method that you'd be expecting, and that's good because that's exactly how I like it to work. But after you make your way out of the bar, down to the sewers and back up to the streets, you'll find yourself in a very clear homage to RE3, which seems to be fan service included just for this demo. To be honest though, if it finds its way into the final release, I'm not exactly gonna mind. And really, a lot of the following sections are gonna give you that same Nemesis energy. There are a few more spots that were clearly made as references to similar areas in 3, but aside from that, the general layout here just feels a lot like that game's rendition of Raccoon City's streets. And honestly, that's a big plus for me. Well, not the RE3 part, although that is very cool, but I'm more talking about the whole streets thing. Now don't get me wrong, a spooky mansion is always going to be an automatic win, but I really like it when these types of games are set in recognizably modern locations. I really could not explain why, but seeing desolated streets, overturned cars, and barricaded windows just does something for me. There's something about a zombie outbreak story taking place in a major city that just pulls on some weird strings in my head. But that's kind of just a me thing, very subjective. I will say more objectively though, don't go into this demo expecting a quick in and out type of experience. This thing is going to go on much longer than you might expect. I really mean it when I say there were like 3 different times when I out loud said to myself, okay, this has to be where they're going to end it. And trust me, that was not a downside. I was loving every minute of Echoes of the Living. I mean, look at it. It's unapologetically survival horror. It checks just about every box I would have wanted, and surprisingly, that's something that doesn't happen a lot in this video series. And I very much need to comment on how damn good these environments look. Now, they're not pre-rendered, but instead fully 3D, but it has gotten to the point where the two are nearly indistinguishable from each other. Either way though, I genuinely am in love with these backdrops. Now, I will admit there were maybe 1 or 2 spots where I would say things are a little more barren and less detailed than the rest, but as a whole, these backgrounds are surprisingly impressive. Alright, so you may have noticed I've been overly positive here, and believe me, Echoes of the Living deserves every bit of the praise I've been giving it so far, but some of you may have also noticed it can be a little rough around the edges. And since I showered it with compliments, I think it's only fair that I point out some of those aforementioned rough edges. Before I do though, I want to say this is a single person developer. I couldn't imagine the amount of work one person would have to go through in order to do all of this stuff, let alone a full team, so I don't want this to come across as me being a dick, but instead, maybe think about it as me pointing out areas that can be improved on in a product I genuinely want to do well. And that being the case, the first issue most people are probably going to notice is the texture pop-in. In the character select screen, it can take several seconds for the road texture to load in, and the intro of the game has a similar issue. To balance that out though, I think these 2 and maybe 1 more screen were the only places I really noticed this was going on, so this cloud does have a bit of a silver lining. Now, I will admit this next one might just be me, but for some reason, I just couldn't get used to the fact that the run button wasn't also the cancel button. I mean, it is sometimes, but in the menu specifically, only triangle or Y would exit out of it. Honestly, I think it's just Resident Evil muscle memory, but this really messed with me, and the entire runtime I was pressing B to get out of my inventory and a second later remembering, oh yeah, it's Y. I also found a few inconsistencies with how keys are used. 99% of the time they're used automatically when you examine a door that needs them, like in Resident Evil, but on a few doors this didn't happen and I needed to go in and manually use them from the inventory. To be fair, either of these methods would be fine with me, just maybe not both simultaneously in the same game. I also found the ragdolling to be a little too, I guess, aggressive sometimes. When a zombie dies, the ragdoll physics can make for a pretty convincing effect, but sometimes they just collapse into themselves in a janky kind of way. It seems to me like the best results come from when the zombie has some sort of momentum going, so a shot knocking them back before the last blow gets dealt, or if they were lunging forward before they died. I did come across the odd visual bug, but what really bothered me is what seems like a full-screen, over-sharpened post-processing effect that can interact with the game's film grain and make for crawling edges in areas with a lot of tightly packed small details. I also found an issue that was rare, but sometimes environment textures can turn white for just a few frames right after the camera angle changes. All of these problems, though small on their own, can definitely come together and slightly sour what is an otherwise awesome little package. Do keep in mind though, this is a demo and not a finished product. From what I've seen, Moonglint is listening to the people who play this thing, and I've got no doubt in my mind it can address most of what I've listed here. And believe me when I say, when the full game drops, I'm going to be the first in line to grab it to make sure that's the case. This thing is just flat out oddly refreshing. Even in a list of games in this video looking to recreate a similar style, Echoes of the Living does a notably amazing job at taking that Resident Evil experience and just injecting it straight into your veins. It seems to me this developer really understands what makes survival horror work as a genre, and they're applying every trick imaginable to create something that believably could have just been some cancelled late 90s RE clone. I am beyond excited to see what other classic horror goodness this game's got waiting for me with its full release, but real quick I have to ask a question. Is this a Crowbar reference? Because if it is, forget all my complaints before. Go ahead and put this thing down as a 10 out of 10.
Forgive me. So, where did I come from? Where do I go?
You know, coming into a video like this is sort of exciting because you never really know what you're going to get outside of the general theme of survival horror, and I'll say I'm not really sure what I was expecting from Simulacrum, but it managed to really surprise me anyways. As the game first starts, we get a glimpse at what seems to be a pretty normal life. Our protagonist wakes up in her apartment and hears her cat scratching at the door. When she tries to let it out, she notices her doorknob is missing, and at the same time she realizes a painting on her wall has been replaced. And next thing we know, we're stuck somewhere resembling Silent Hill's Otherworld, which is actually kind of fitting because graphical rough spots aside, this thing right here may as well be some kind of a lost chapter from SH3. I mean, it's uncanny. The look of your environment, religious imagery and themes, the color palette, puzzles, it even controls like a Silent Hill title. Well, except for the lack of a quick turn, which, believe me, is sorely missed. You'll be running around this rusted sheet metal and chain link paradise trying to figure out how to get back home, and in the process you'll need to solve some genuinely tough puzzles. These things can be insanely tricky if you're not taking in every bit of info coming your way, and of course the old strategy of trying to use every item on everything you see. I also noticed that as I played, the map fills itself in when areas or objects of interest are found, and I know I already said this, but I mean, this is just flat out Silent Hill. It's not a well-made homage, but instead it feels like a one-to-one copy. And that might sound like an insult, but it takes a lot of knowledge and skill to pull something like this off. You really have to have a deep-rooted love for your source material, and after spending about 2 hours playing Chapter 1 of this thing, I have no doubt that's exactly the kind of admiration this project was born from. The music is also clearly looking to emulate that Akira Yamaoka sound, and while it would be hard for anyone to top that man's list of absolute survival horror sound design gold, some of these tracks get pretty damn close. The focus is a very clear mix of ambient soundscapes punctuated by more industrial elements, and I'm always going to like that specific combination no matter who's behind it. The environment the game takes place in does an amazing job of straddling that clear line between a dark, chaotic Jacob's Ladder nightmare scene and your more recognizable visual themes, which, in my opinion, makes the feeling of dread and isolation all the more effective. Of course, being surrounded by occult, religious, and undecipherable iconography also makes sure you're always stuck in limbo between not knowing what the hell's going on here, but having an inkling whatever it is, it's not good. I've always enjoyed that approach, and unsurprisingly, it's one that Team Silent excelled at. In SH games, you were always being shown just enough to get your imagination to kick in, filling in a lot of psychological blanks, and I think that made for a horror experience that even a team of incredibly skilled developers and artists could never even get close to. After all, what scares man more than the contents of his own psyche, right? I think the horror game sector is running a little light on approaches like this lately. People often go too far into that gross-out territory or trap a game's meaning behind so many walls of vagueness it's effectively inaccessible. Rarely do you see something that slots right into the middle of that spectrum, and I think that makes Simulacrum really special. It creates this space that's both spooky and disturbing, but on a deeper level, and it also makes you curious enough to want to see more of it. That's really a lost art in my opinion. However, it's not a perfect production, obviously. I feel like handling is a little too slow and unresponsive sometimes. Luckily, there is no combat in this chapter, so I don't have to worry about dodging enemies, but at first I really struggled with taking turns and navigating well. When I stopped using the D-pad and started using the analog stick, a lot of these issues cleared up, but even then it still felt like I was just barely able to do what I wanted with the controls. And of course, with a lower budget title, you're not going to expect graphical perfection, so I can let these weird-ass ponytails slide, but it is a little weird that our heroine is constantly stuck with a face that resembles a Reddit atheist about to type citation needed into a comment section. And honestly, I would really love to see some actual Silent Hill style combat included. Don't get me wrong, this developer absolutely nailed the exploration, item hunting, and puzzle solving of the genre, but leaving out the combat or sense of danger sort of leaves it feeling, I don't know, maybe incomplete. Hopefully in Chapter 2, which does seem to be in active development, we can see some kind of higher stakes, but even if there isn't, this was still a really damn interesting playthrough. If you're a fan of Silent Hill and you're as sure as I am that the new SH2 remake is going to shit the bed as far as survival horror gameplay goes, this might be one of your last options. So I would say go ahead and clear maybe 2 hours from your schedule and try out one of the absolute best Silent Hill inspired games I may have ever played before.
But how did you manage to get here?
Didn't you want me to follow you?
That was not the question.
The Pale is another short demo from itch.io and another really interesting setup. You play as Arthur, a new lighthouse keeper heading to an island off of Maine called, well, the Pale. You're here to replace the guy who used to work this beat thanks to him being hospitalized with chest pains. It seems like this island used to be home to a fishing village that dried up eventually, and for about 15 years now it's been abandoned. When you first step foot on the island, the atmosphere is thick and oppressive just like I like it. There are abandoned buildings to explore, and your flashlight just barely illuminates the space directly in front of your character. In these first few moments, I also noticed that a lot of the demo is silent as far as music goes, opting for ambient sound effects instead, which I think adds to the atmosphere. Before Arthur can get to bed, he's got to turn on the generator and get the lighthouse running. In the process, he ends up messing with a control panel of sorts and... well, the result is sort of a mystery. It looks like he frees some kind of a giant Lovecraftian nightmare, but you never really see what the hell's on the other end of this massive chain and what seems to be a collar. After that, you radio your contact and let them know things are up and running, of course deciding to leave out the part where you may have released an eldritch horror onto the world, and she lets you know that the keeper you've been sent out to replace just died in the hospital, which is a real bummer, but Arthur beds down for the night, and when he wakes up he finds a storm headed his way. In the process of battening down the hatches and preparing for the oncoming gale, he comes across what looks like a skinned dead body on the beach. Obviously, his first reaction is to radio the mainland, but when his radio breaks, he's got to gather the tools to fix it. In doing so, he crosses paths with that dead body again, only it's made some friends in the meantime. At this point, an insane amount of skinless bodies are now on the beach, making things somehow more dire than they were before. After sort of getting in touch with his ride, she tells him to meet her at the docks, but just then the power goes out and we hear the sound of glass breaking, which I've noticed never precedes anything good. Well, it turns out those skinless corpses weren't as corpse-like as we originally thought. After putting that abomination down, Arthur heads towards the docks, but we find out the island is now crawling with these things and fighting them is not exactly an option. So instead, he tries to outrun them until they crowd him on a bridge. a bridge that wasn't exactly in the best condition to start with, so the thing eventually snaps and that's where our demo ends. According to the developer, the final version of this game is going to release sometime this year, which is great, but this little teaser does a lot of things right. The mystery of the island, the feeling of isolation, and the use of unseen horrors, it really has a lot going for it for such a short demo that includes not as much gameplay as you might expect. On its itch.io page, the developer says it's an hour-long demo, but I got through it in maybe 30 minutes, so there might be some stuff I failed to do, but either way, I really like what I'm seeing here. Sadly, this is yet another indie horror game that forgoes the D-pad for analog stick-based tank controls, something that never feels quite right. But movement and turning speed are all pretty tight, so things are definitely better than they could be. I'll tell you one thing, this running animation most definitely reminds me of old early 90s CG renders, which is sort of funny, but it also kind of adds to the charm here. Speaking of which, this is yet another game going for that PS1 style aesthetic, but again, it looks more to me like early PC game low poly graphics. I'm definitely not complaining though. To me, there's something about the use of simplistic graphics to approximate realistic locations that really helps sell a horror atmosphere. I can't exactly explain it. I don't know, maybe there's some kind of dissonance going on, but either way, I really like it. This may be a very, very short teaser of what's to come, but if this developer can keep up even a portion of this atmosphere and dread, we have one amazingly fun RE clone on our hands.
You invite travelers to stay that night and knock them out cold. They wake up with whiskers and a tail, and a longing desire to shit in a box.
I know what you're talking about. That got shut down and turned into a tourist resort. I stayed there last March. They make a good Benedict.
This one I've had my sights fixed on for a while now. I first came across Prototype Mansion before it was available on Steam. It had caught my eye with the reputation it had built, but I'd say more than anything, it was the look that drew me in. A look that, if I'm being honest, sort of wore out its welcome pretty early on for me. I mean, this is a cool idea on paper, but I think a lot of these PS1 style games tend to focus really hard on making the in-game graphics look worse in order to get across the feeling that they're old. But there was a genuine process behind how the PS1 rendered 3D graphics, and I feel like no one actually tries to replicate that. Instead, they just severely lower the internal render resolution and throw a CRT display option in there. Oh, and by the way, don't use that in this game. It's way too blurry. It genuinely hurt my eyes after a while. Anyways, the game looks okay enough in motion, but when things come to a stop, immediately you notice the aliasing gets way worse. Like the model's resolution gets cut in half. And when your character is too far from the camera, they scale to like 4 on-screen pixels. I know all that sounds a bit harsh, but there's a lot I like about this game's presentation. It just so happens to be doing something I see in a lot of these indie titles, and this is just the section of the video I decided to unload all that. Well, continuing on, when I started Prototype Mansion up, I got the immediate feeling that this game exists somewhere between a parody and homage. It definitely plays a lot like an old survival horror game, with the only big difference being regular third-person controls as opposed to tank controls, which, I'll be honest, did take me a while to get used to. Besides that though, it feels like a fun, if rudimentary example of the genre. The whole parody thing comes into play with how much the game is dedicated to comedy. Comedy that I'm happy to say is actually kind of funny. Nearly every scene is a spoof of some kind of genre trope, and even your actions in-game can have a comedic effect. Like that time I busted into a room blasting a zombie but fired one extra bullet as it went down, and that extra round just so happened to explode a nearby cat. I didn't notice any puzzles in the game, but collecting items and backtracking do seem to make up the lion's share of exploration, and it's pretty damn tough in terms of avoiding damage and conserving ammo. I had to restart a few times because I either died or got to a point where I ran completely dry on resources. And I would love to tell you more, but this game crashed on me 5 or 6 times over the course of making this video, and since the game saves at specific progress checks, I kept having to replay the same sections over and over again. After that last crash, I sort of washed my hands of the thing. I honestly would have loved to have played more because I had just started getting an idea for how the game was wanting me to play so I could hold on to as much ammo as I could, but I guess it is what it is. Luckily though, this same developer made another survival horror game that's available on Steam, so let's check that one out and hope it salvages my crushed hopes. And if there's one thing I can say about Jupiter Lighthouse's next game, Garden Variety Body Horror, it's that it's definitely a more refined, less slapdash version of Prototype Mansion. Movement isn't quite so fast and floaty, combat is way better, and the area the game takes place in is much bigger and more, intelligently laid out. Heading to the options screen, we've got a few different options, including a much improved CRT filter, but more importantly, an option for a 480p VGA mode, which seems to double the amount of on-screen pixels. And this right here is what I call a happy medium between getting across that low poly, low res look, but also providing a nice looking and visually understandable picture. Now, from what I gather, this is supposed to be a sequel to the last game, and as such, you'll be taking on the other half of the team this time. All around, it feels like a much more complex and, more full experience, which is really nice. We've got the same non-tank controlled system, but this time, instead of a more fixed perspective, the camera follows pretty close to Hank, kind of like a third-person shooter. In moments when that's not the case, you can hold L1 to orient it behind him, but this is a really slow process and can be sort of unreliable sometimes. On the opposite side of that coin, I found this very cool mechanic where you can either use cans of tuna to feed stray cats, which acts as a save point, or you can consume it to gain back health. Tying such a limited resource to two different functions is kind of cool and a welcome change to your normal survival horror orthodoxy. Now, I'm front-loading all of these compliments because, to be honest, I really want to like this game. Its humor is honestly really funny, and they even made the voiceover Japanese to give it a sort of PS1 game so low budget they didn't even bother translating it kind of feel, but I just was not having fun past the first, 20 minutes or so. I think my biggest issue here is the fact that it has to be played in this very hyper-specific order, otherwise you can make the experience significantly more difficult for yourself. Items like ammo and weapons are hidden a little too well in my opinion, and that goes double for necessary paths that you need to take to move forward. Like I said, you can play this game in a way that makes things much harder for you, and there are these odd decisions like these boxes here that can act as RE-style item chests, which is actually kind of great. And even better, you need to slot fuses into them to open them up, and there aren't many of those just lying around, so you might have to take some fuses from a fuse box, which means making once-lit areas dark. Once you spend a fuse, it breaks forever, but you get access to that box forever, and all the items you put in it are available in any other boxes you decide to open. So where's the problem here? Well, if you're like me, you may have tried avoiding opening some of these for that very reason, opting instead to have only a few open, making it a little harder in terms of backtracking, but at least you're not spending precious resources, right? Well, if you do that, you may miss out on a flashlight that sits in your vest pocket, which is something I would say is vital to completing the game. The normal flashlight does the same exact job the other one does, but it has to be unequipped in order to shoot your guns and then re-equipped after a fight, otherwise the environment can be way too dark to actually navigate. There might be 10 more examples like this that can have you essentially soft-locking yourself into a much harder game than it has to be. And believe me, this is already a hard enough game as it is. There are enemies that stand dead still till you get within grabbing range, and they're covered in the same stuff the entire game world is, plants and flowers. Add that to these assholes that can one-hit kill you and move faster than you do, and you've got a game where progress needs to be gained through trial and error. You essentially just die and reload till you're familiar with what's to come, or you do what I did and have to restart the game 3 or so times because you were in an unwinnable situation. For example, if you just so happen to walk into this room, which is totally accessible after you read a paper, without finding the shotgun, which itself is deviously hidden, you're flat out not going to be able to beat this boss. Because not even a survival horror savant would have the handgun ammo needed by this point. I don't know guys, I sort of feel bad about this one, because a really interesting and rewarding survival horror game is staring me right in the face. It's just inches outside of my grasp. I really can tell a lot of the decisions made here were done to spice up the genre's typical gameplay, and I can see a lot of them working really well if they weren't in a game that actively fights the player every step of the way. I really got a kick out of the horror, and while the game was a little too tongue-in-cheek for the atmosphere to get too creepy, it definitely tries to get there. Seeing how big of a jump it is going from prototype to garden variety, I'd love to see what Jupiter Lighthouse comes out with next. It seems like maybe all they need is another crack at this formula to really perfect it, but as far as what's here is concerned, it's just a little too adversarial to the player to be much fun, at least for me. I do want to point out that it's pretty common for me to have some weird taste, and I'm not exactly one of those people who actively seeks out difficult video games, so there still might be a chance that this will be something you'll get into. And even though I'm not its biggest fan, the formula and execution-driven nature of this thing makes it feel like the kind of game people who like speedrunning would really get a kick out of. So maybe there's some value here that I'm just not seeing, but as far as I'm concerned, this is more like a lot of potential with two really botched landings. And having said all of that, I really don't like being negative in these videos because I do recognize that I do tend to be drawn to some weird stuff. So instead of these games are bad, maybe take this as they're just not for me.
殺してやる。このシャベルで。ハンク?
Lake Haven Chrysalis is a bit of a preview for the upcoming survival horror title Lake Haven. Like Holstin, I'm pretty sure this was just a vertical slice to get people interested in what's to come, and I'd say it most definitely had that effect on me. This is yet another title chasing that early PS1 3D aesthetic, and out of all the games in this video so far, I'd say this one pulls it off with the most skill. In fact, this might be the best attempt I've ever seen, period. And by the way, this is Jared coming in after the video started being edited, and there's a game coming up that's going to make that statement 100% false, so stay tuned for that, I guess. Like you would expect, this game makes use of low-poly 3D models, but also goes the extra mile with some very accurate dithering, and they even made sure the console's signature affine texture warping looked right on the money. It defaults to a 4:3 aspect ratio, which I will always appreciate, but I think we'll go for 16:9 for this video's sake. Video stuff aside, it is very clear that Lake Haven is targeting that Silent Hill style of gameplay. Everything from the font and item pickups right down to the dithering seems lifted from Konami's psychological horror masterpiece. And in a world of RE clones, being an SH clone makes you stand out in the best kind of way. There isn't much actual story given at the start, except that you're some kind of detective and you've been given a case that has brought you to this old farmhouse. Inside, we find a dead woman, and from there, the goal is to see exactly what went down here and why. In doing so, you'll deal with the kind of puzzle solving, diary reading, and exploration you would expect from this type of game, and it's all perfectly executed if you ask me. This is a relatively small location, it being a demo and all, but it's packed with key items to find and esoteric actions you're going to need to carry out. As you unlock more of the house and the creepy cult tunnels underneath it, you'll come across the dead woman's diary entries, which chronicle what seems to be a battle with onset mental illness and paranoia. Paranoia and mental illness, which seems to have driven her husband away, and this might handwave some of the stuff we've discovered so far, but it definitely doesn't tackle the issue of the aforementioned Lovecraftian tunnels underneath the house. After maybe 15 minutes of gameplay, things start to hint at a more supernatural sort of undertone, and by the end, those little hints turn into outright screams when things start heading in a very Twin Peaks dream logic sort of direction. You can definitely get the most brief idea of what the finished game's story might be like here with the demo, but if it can set up a mystery, even a portion as interesting as this one, it's going to be pretty damn amazing. I really can't say why, but I kind of like the lack of voice acting here. I'm not really sure if the final game is going to include VA, but I kind of hope it doesn't. I don't know, it just helps with the atmosphere, makes it feel so much more engrossing. There is a single part of Chrysalis that includes combat, and it works about how you'd want it to. And I really gotta say, I like the nods to PT and SH2 and its secret ending. You always love to see Easter eggs like this. When the full release of Lake Haven comes out, about the only thing I'd want to see changed are the camera angles, or at least a mechanic tied to the camera angles. This game goes for that familiar SH style, having the camera stay fixed but follow the player on a set course through certain scenes. The only real exception being you can't hit a button to fix the camera to your character's back here like you can in SH, and honestly, Chrysalis has some of the most tense and attractive angles I've ever seen in this type of game. Specifically, I really like how the camera gives you this creepy voyeur kind of feeling with how it moves organically, like someone's actually looking at you from that angle. It's really effective. My only problem comes into play when these camera angles are changing from scene to scene. It feels like that changeover is just a little slower than it should be, leading to me seemingly walking off the screen and staying out of view of the camera for a little too long to be comfortable. In the final game, if there's some kind of a threat to look out for, which I assume there will be, I imagine this would lead to a cheap hit or two. It's certainly not the largest problem a video game can suffer from, but it definitely feels to me like the camera transitions last maybe 1 second too long. Oh, and the CRT filter makes the picture way too soft, but you can toggle that off in the options, so it's a non-issue really. Those two small, if you can call them gripes aside, this is one hell of a promising preview. I've always been a bit of a Silent Hill 1 fanatic, and out of all the attempts that have been made to recreate that game's specific look and feel, this has got to be by far the most accurate. Just like its inspiration, Lake Haven doesn't seem keen on the idea of telling you exactly what's going on here, which very well could come back to bite it in its ass later, but as of now, I'll say these guys have set up an amazingly interesting mystery, and I absolutely can't wait to get my hands on the finished product. When I make these RE clone videos, I typically have at least an idea of what I'm getting into. I've either been following the project for a while, or it's something a viewer or a friend has suggested, along with a brief description, but this is a very different story. To be totally honest, I can't really remember what drove me to download the demo for You Will Die Here Tonight, but I can tell you one thing, it has easily become one of the most interesting entries on this list. Starting it up, we get a very familiar setup. There have been reports of brutal murders, and a team of specially trained police have been sent to a huge mansion to bring in the perpetrators. Ringing any bells yet? Trust me though, the homage does not stop there. This Ares division all wear very stars-adjacent gear, with each member being color-coded and having the expected and very necessary shoulder pads. Callbacks to Resident Evil aside, this game bounces back and forth between what seems to be obvious tongue-in-cheek caricature to some genuinely dark seriousness. This guy right here delivers some of the most personally relatable writing I've ever seen, with lines like, "My arms are too muscular to reach into this vase," and things like this wouldn't happen if butlers were taught self-defense. But then that's juxtaposed to a section where an Ares member suffers through the guilt of losing his daughter while he's on the verge of dying himself. It's kind of all over the place, and I think I like it. There's a cool twist at the end of the demo, which you could probably argue was at least inspired by Resident Evil, and I would say it's pulled off really well. I really like the writing here. I think it matches the actual gameplay to a pretty scary degree. Normally, I would say I like my games to take themselves a bit more seriously, but I don't know, it just works really well here. Kind of like a cheesy movie that knows how cheesy it really is, so it's got free reign to do the most ridiculous stuff that wouldn't work in a more serious production. Hey, there's a quote for the back of the box. This is the video game equivalent of a Neil Breen movie in all the best ways. Gameplay-wise, we're dealing with a very cool assortment of honestly unique ideas. First off, the general gameplay premise is that you take control of this police squad one member at a time, and at least in this demo, dying is a foregone conclusion. You play each Ares member and get to the point where they're killed somehow, and then you unlock the next person in line. Apparently in the game proper, the things you do with one team member can affect the next person you play as, which sounds like a better use of the RE2 zapping system than you can find in RE2 Remake. At least as far as this demo goes, each Ares member seems to act as a sort of tutorial for the different kinds of gameplay you can expect to come up against. Puzzle solving, item hunting, dodging zombies, and of course combat. Speaking of which, when a zombie grabs you or you initiate a fight, you'll be taken to a very Resident Evil Gaiden sort of screen where you can deal with The Walking Dead in first person. Where Gaiden wanted you to do damage with timing-based attacks though, this game has you just plain old first-person shooting. Melee attacks seem to be just about as useless as they normally are in an RE game outside of Code Veronica, and I'd say that's a good move balance-wise in a game that aims to have you conserving ammo but also wants a bit of difficulty. One thing that was pretty novel is the fact that initiating combat while other zombies are nearby will bring them into the fray, and they could be anywhere on the playfield, so you might have to keep your head on a swivel. This gives the fights a tactical bend that I think is going to be awesome to see in the full release. Speaking of which, it seems to me this is one of those deals where the demo is its own thing separate from the actual finished product and is meant as a vertical slice of what they're trying to accomplish. And if that is indeed the case, color me incredibly interested. I don't know quite how to explain it, but this game just pulls everything off perfectly. Movement, exploration, puzzle solving, combat, it all just feels really tight and well implemented. I did run into the occasional problem, like not being able to run out of a door despite it looking like I was perfectly lined up to do so, but you might just chalk that up to the game's nearly isometric perspective. Other than that though, I really don't have anything to complain about. I do, however, have a lot more stuff to compliment, especially as far as the game's presentation goes. Backgrounds seem to be 2D pre-renders, which you know I always love, but in an odd twist, so are the characters. It looks like they're using that old Donkey Kong digitized approach by rendering out CG models and bit crushing them down to create animated sprites. Honestly, it's something I didn't really know I wanted to see in a new game till I did here. You can tell they really wanted to sell that look because they certainly could have made the animations more fluid with more frames, or at least I'm assuming they could have, but they chose to keep it choppy, and honestly I commend that move. It completes the package in a way and leads to something very interesting. In a fight, things switch to 3D graphics with some really just amazingly fluid animations, only the render resolution is super low, leading to this really satisfying aliasing. It's kind of similar to what you could produce upscaling a really good-looking 480p image from the PS2 or GameCube era, or maybe when you run old PC games at modern resolutions. And what I mean by all that is, it's awesome. Both in and out of combat, you can count on a smart use of real-time lighting and other post-processing effects to add that extra bit of atmosphere, and overall, I just really couldn't be more hyped on how a game looks. Like I said before, this whole package is not something I would have thought to desire from a video game, but now that I've seen it all working together, I might be in love. You Will Die Here Tonight's demo is relatively short. You could probably blast through it in about half an hour, but it tells a relatively complete, albeit compressed tale that definitely serves the intended purpose. As far as I can see, there's no hard date set for this game's actual release, so if you need me, I'll just be hitting F5 on its Steam page for the foreseeable future. When I first caught a glimpse at Sense's Midnight, it looked a little familiar to me, and that's because I had already played its developer Suzaku's other release, Sense, a cyberpunk ghost story, and I kinda liked it. Midnight is a combination of common Japanese horror tropes with a bit of a modern twist. You play as Kaho, and your friend group are into ghosts, specifically researching them. You're at a public park in Ikebukuro investigating some old ghost story that saw some people stumbling upon a woman who had hung herself, which apparently cursed them and the park. Kaho is in the park doing all the legwork, but she's got her friends with her in the sense that they're all in a group chat together. Every time you come across something out of the ordinary or useful, they'll chime in, and this mechanic allows the game to run typical tutorial type stuff by the player without breaking the fourth wall too much. As Kaho comes across the door to the spot where the corpse was supposed to have been found, she ends up activating this park's trap card, and now she's stuck here, surrounded by ghosts and other members of some more common Japanese folklore. Alright, so I'm going to be totally honest with you guys, this game is not my cup of tea right from the start because I tend not to get into Japanese ghost stories too much. I'm not really sure why that is, but there's just something conceptually that doesn't do much for me there. That being said, it is novel having a horror game like this set in a cyberpunk-looking future Tokyo. I mean, my house is like 20 minutes away from Ikebukuro, and it adds an extra layer of coolness, just not enough to get me over the whole Japanese ghost story thing. Moving on to the gameplay, at first this thing might throw you for a loop. When it starts up and you notice that usable camera in your inventory, you're probably going to think the same thing I did. Obvious Fatal Frame type direction, right? Well, actually no. You can take pictures of things, and that mechanic is linked to progression and exploration sometimes, but instead of using a camera to hurt the spirits that are after you, Sense is more of a run and hide type of game, and sadly that's another one of my pet peeves. I've never really enjoyed the non-combat approach to horror games, honestly, and because of that, I couldn't really tell you if the run and hide mechanics here are any better or worse than the other games that include them, so take any of my criticisms with a grain of salt. When you find a hiding spot, there's a mechanic that lets you hold your breath, but successfully doing so doesn't seem to make the ghost go away, so there were a few times where I'd just be sitting there holding my breath, waiting for him to leave, and then eventually I'd just get up and run away with them standing right on top of me. On a more objective level, it would be nice if the items had names or, I don't know, could be examined. You only have 4 item slots, and there were a few times where I'd end up having to drop everything I had found, and I wasn't sure what was necessary for any upcoming puzzles. And I think a quick description or some flavor text would definitely solve that problem. Your run speed is also a little too slow for my liking. It seems like just about everything can outrun you, which I assume was the point as far as enemies go, but when exploring the pretty wide open areas of the park, it feels like progress is made at a crawl. Alright, so you probably already figured this out, but I just don't think this is the type of game for me. I did, however, want to make sure it was included in the video because it does satisfy a lot of my requirements for being called an RE clone, and if some of you end up liking what you're seeing, you can support the developer and try it out for yourself. It may not be my cup of well-endowed tea, but different strokes for different folks, right?
No one who's gone has ever come back.
Listen, it is no secret that the quickest way to my heart is to recreate that PS1 graphical aesthetic, and with it being such a hot style nowadays, for the first time in a very long time, people like me are eating well, and, well, I'm not planning on going on a diet anytime soon. Speaking of which, Heartworm is a survival horror title from Vincent Adinolfi. Sincerely, I hope I said that right. And after spending about half an hour beating its demo, it's joining the long list of upcoming titles that have my day one purchase stamp of approval. As you can see, it's using an incredibly accurate version of what you would see graphically spinning up a PS1 game right now, and what's that, like 2 modern games on this list that make use of dithering? I'm in heaven, guys. On that note, you can technically disable the dithering if you want, but just know if you do, you'll be hurting me. There's also an option to disable quote-unquote pixelation, which pulls off a look that sort of reminds me of those Bleem discs that would allow you to put PS1 games in your Dreamcast and play them at 480p. Well, I think you guys know me well enough to know which option I'm going to go with, and I'll tell you this right now, this very well may be the best looking game we've talked about all day. I mean, it's obviously well within my wheelhouse, which is always appreciated, but PS1 low poly graphics aside, the camera angles and creative scenery here is just on another level. The use of CRTs everywhere, the creepy dreamlike decorations, and analog video static for enemies, it's honestly very unique and truly impressive. As far as the story goes, this is just a short demo, so don't expect too much, but the game starts out with an introduction scene where our main character is talking about how she heard about this place near a power plant where people have been able to cross over to the other side and see the people that they've lost. She vows to check this place out for herself, so as a woman of her word, she heads out there, and that's about the only story you're gonna get. There are a few notes and journal entries you can find, but most of them pertain to one of the demo's puzzles, and the others are just short messages from people who have come to this place for the same reason as you. After searching around this old abandoned house for a bit, we find a key to the attic, which leads us to this weird MC Escher-esque area, and when we try to leave, whatever the hell this is makes sure that doesn't happen. In order to get away from this guy, our protagonist heads through a door seemingly leading to nowhere, and she wakes up in this Nightmare on Elm Street dream sequence where video static people are looking to punch her to death. The goal in this area is to collect 3 items to slot into a door, which, like the preceding moments, will have you engaging in good old-fashioned survival horror gameplay. You've got a limited inventory, key hunting, backtracking, puzzle solving, combat that can be avoided if you want, and of course exploration. Movement feels incredibly tight and perfectly tuned for the genre, and while the quick turn isn't activated with down and run like I usually like, it is mapped to the L trigger, so I'm still a happy camper. The first time I did some initial research into the game for this video, I saw that a camera was being used as a weapon, and again I assumed Fatal Frame style mechanics, but when you aim your camera, you essentially switch to an over-the-shoulder perspective and things play out like they would if you were holding a gun. It's functionally the same thing, but the camera just fits better into this world for some reason. I will say the change to the combat perspective when pressing right trigger can be a little jarring sometimes, and there were a few times when it locked onto the wrong orientation. Like right here, I pressed R while facing the enemy, but when the camera zoomed in, it turned me around and aimed at the whole lot of nothing behind my character. This wasn't exactly something I could get to happen more than, I don't know, maybe twice, and it only went down in this open area as far as I can tell, so it's nothing to be worried about, but definitely something I think the developer should look into. Since the in-game static entities are relatively slow, they have a projectile that does no damage but will slow your character down if she gets hit, so dodging them isn't as easy as you might first think. Seems to me like the ones that are inside or in tighter areas don't use this attack, so there's definitely been some purposeful balancing done here. Despite the switch to the over-the-shoulder view, combat here seems to feel more true to the genre, and that goes for just about everything else. It looks like the goal is to conserve the slim amount of resources you come across, and that's all pluses as far as I'm concerned. Music tends to lean towards the more smooth and ambient side of things most of the time, with a heavy emphasis on piano licks, and you're not going to see me complain about that. Like a Silent Hill title, this game knows when to use music and when not to in order to build up an intentional mood, which is a rare skill nowadays. There may not be more than maybe half an hour's worth of gameplay to be found in this demo, but I can tell you right now it paints a perfectly clear picture of what the developer is looking to include in the final version. And that being the case, I am beyond excited to see that thing release. Heartworm seems to be this perfect marriage of the gameplay foundation and style of Resident Evil games, mashed perfectly together with more thought-provoking visual cues meant to instill a subconscious effect. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I get the feeling there's meaning to all this weirdness beyond the trope of girl goes ghost hunting in an abandoned house, which is a combination I wholeheartedly welcome. This thing sounds, feels, and plays like real deal, honest-to-goodness survival horror, and as far as I'm concerned, me saying that is the same as giving it my full, unadulterated recommendation. So you might as well head on over to Heartworm's Steam page and give the demo a download. If you've come to this channel specifically for this type of video, I've got no issue saying you have a 99.9999% chance of falling in love with it the same way that I have. Well guys, that's about all the survival horror and survival horror adjacent games I could scrape together for the time being. Like I said at the start, this is without a doubt the most banger-filled collection to date, so if you found something on the list that tickles your fancy, make sure to give it a shot. These developers are doing us all a service by producing the type of games we've been begging for years. We just need to do our part, which luckily only requires us to, play them. I hope you guys had a good time with this one, because I always get a kick out of getting to sample so many awesome and unique projects. Here's hoping it won't be too long till the industry has built up enough new ones that I can put another one of these videos together for you. Till then though, thanks so much for stopping by. As usual, I'm Jared.
I bet we're in for some real astral plane body swapping kind of shit tonight.
And this is Avalanche Reviews. Well, hello there. Thank you all very much for spending just a bit of your day with me. I hope you found something in this video that speaks to you, and if that's the case, feel free to support more projects like this one over on Patreon and here by becoming a YouTube partner. It's the generosity of random strangers like yourself that makes sure I'm able to keep creating the videos that I want to make, as opposed to the ones that are guaranteed to make the most amount of ad revenue. So for every release of mine that isn't a Minecraft roleplay with a Fortnite graphics mod, you guys are to thank. And you know, I say that as a joke, but I'm almost positive I could find a video like that with 2 minutes of Googling, because we live in hell. Well, see you guys later and have a good one.